All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to resume the meeting. I believe we left off on item number 5. We left off at item number 5, review of city roadwork warranty requirements. I believe we finished questions to staff. I don't have a list of any speakers. Are there any speakers or motions to this item? Sorry? Which item? 5, review of cities roadwork warranty requirements. So I don't have any motions here, and we're finished with.
I'll move staff recommendation.
Okay, so adoption of the staff recommendation moved by Councillor McKelvey. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Looks like we're moving to item 7. We have deputations for that. Beverly Thorpe. This is Asperger's Bay Treatment Plant Pelletizer. Yes, Ms. Thorpe? Yes, please. No, we're moving along here. Thank you for coming in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Good afternoon. I am Beverly Thorpe, an environmental consultant and educator with a specialization in chemicals. I'm also a member of the Bathurst Quay Neighbourhood Association and an associate member and supporter of the Canadian National Farmers Union. I'm here today because I noted an application, 11.7, to continue spreading biosolids for agricultural use in southwestern Ontario, which yesterday rang alarm bells for me, and which is why I'm here today. My most recent research is focused on a class of chemicals known as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS for short. These synthetic chemicals, which have been used widely since the 1960s, are also known as forever chemicals because they are highly persistent in the environment and will take hundreds, if not thousands of years to disappear from the soil and groundwater where they accumulate. From a health perspective, all Canadians surveyed by Health Canada now contain levels of PFAS in our blood. PFAS has been linked to a range of health impacts, including thyroid diseases, kidney and liver cancer, and elevated cholesterol, to name just 3. PFAS are used in stain and grease-resistant applications and products such as non-stick cookware, grease and waterproof coatings on food packaging, such as the microwavable popcorn bags, fast food wrappers and takeout containers, and also carpets, clothing, and firefighting foam used to fight fuel-based fires at airports and military installations. Here in Toronto, our Great Lakes are contaminated with PFAS chemicals, and the most notorious chemicals in this class are now official chemicals of mutual concern in the Great Lakes Basin. A major point source of PFAS emissions into our environment are from landfills and wastewater treatment plants. Wastewater treatment plants, why? Because of the discharge into the sewer system by industries using PFAS, plus the use and intentional or sometimes accidental discharge of firefighting foam at airports and military bases that, of course, eventually ends up in our waterways, and also from PFAS in household dust from the products we use that eventually gets washed down our drains. PFAS has been measured at high levels in Toronto air, which is typical of other urban environments. Our federal government has restricted the use of a handful of PFAS chemicals, but thousands of other unrestricted PFAS are on the market, and many of these new replacement chemicals are even more soluble in water, which means there is a constant input of PFAS into our water systems. Yet we have no drinking water standards for PFAS in Ontario, nor do we have wastewater effluent standards for PFAS or restrictions in sewage sludge for application on land. So what does this have to do with biosolids and wastewater treatment plants such as Asperger's Bay? I notice we have an overhead, so this is a fact sheet, so I'm just going to stick that on as a bit of an image. A 2014 study of PFAS levels across 20 Canadian wastewater treatment plants found increased levels of PFAS in water and air around these plants. It is surmised that advanced biological treatments, such as at Asperger's Bay, can actually transform the levels of PFAS in the influent into other and more numerous forms of PFAS into the effluent and air. And of course, PFAS is also found in the sludge. So my question here today is, are these biosolid pellets from Asperger's Bay wastewater treatment plant tested for PFAS prior to marketing and use? This is an important question. In a recent case this past summer, Fred Stone, a dairy farmer in Maine, was forced to dispose of his milk. There's Fred. Was forced to dispose of his milk after discovering the soil, hay, and the milk from the cows on his farm contained extremely high levels of PFAS chemicals. The source of PFAS was biosolids promoted during a 1980s state program to fertilize the pastures with treated sludge waste. The discovery of PFAS contamination on his farm and other contaminated sites in Maine and around the country prompted Maine's governor to form a task force to study the extent of PFAS contamination at more than 95 sites. In Wisconsin, the city of Marinette has stopped distributing biosolids to farms after getting high PFAS readings. In Michigan, tests on PFAS and sludge at 41 plants
You could, you're over 5 minutes, if you could wrap up.
10 seconds, thank you. So there's a lot of work happening at U.S. state level, and I would just hate to see farmers in southwestern Ontario suffer a similar fate to Fred Stone or find that their market is at risk from a preventable PFAS source. And for this reason, I believe it would be highly advisable to test for levels of PFAS in biosolids prior to marketing and use in Ontario, as well as set stringent limits for PFAS in biosolids. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for the Deputy, Councillor McKelvey?
Thank you. I don't know that we set the standards. I can ask that later. I think it's the Ontario Ministry. But are there other chemicals as well that you find are of concern or emerging in biosolids that we should be wary of?
There are a range. The reason why PFAS is getting so much attention in scientific and policy arenas right now is because they just don't degrade. So we're actually facing the legacy of these chemicals from even our use 50 years ago. And that's why there's so much effort working at municipal and state level in the US, for instance, to stop the flow of these PFAS chemicals into wastewater treatment plants.
And what about, for example, pharmaceuticals? Because we continually try to design drugs so that they don't necessarily break down super fast in the body. And so some of those same properties that make them great for treating illness, unfortunately lead to, high resistance to breakdown by biochemical processes. So what about those ones as well?
Yep. Everything ranging from birth control pills to pharmaceuticals. This is why pharmaceutical take-back is so important as a policy at the city and provincial level. But again, the reason why I'm raising this issue is because now that increased testing is happening south of the border, particularly in the Great Lakes Basin, because these are chemicals of high concern in the Great Lakes, I think we're going to have a lot of questions asked about the quality of our soil and agricultural levels here. And I just want us to get ahead and not be defensive when a lot of questions are asked. I have to say that Environment Canada has been doing a lot of monitoring, but we have no policies to actually restrict any of these chemicals in our industrial effluent, in our sewage sludge, but also just in the companies that use them in the Toronto area. We should at least be monitoring what's coming out down into our sewer systems.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McKelvey. Any other questions for the deputant? No? Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone else here to depute on this item? And Alexandra Mechek? Great. Thank you very much for coming.
Me. This is for 1.17, the EV strategy, is that correct?
This is, no, this is item 7, Asperger's Bay.
Oh, I thought so, sorry, yes, I registered for 1.17, sorry, I don't know how that got mixed up, but I'll come back. Thank you.
All right, okay. Are there any, is there anyone else to dispute on this item? No? Questions for staff? Councillor McKelvey?
Hi, do we set the levels for our biosolids, or is that done by the Ministry of the Environment?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, the regulation of biosolids is done by the province, and it's done under the Nutrient Management Act. There are other sources of legislation that we have to follow with respect to our effluent discharges, and that's under the Ontario Water Resources Act. There are provisions and environmental approvals that we have to follow there. And what we do regulate is, within the city, is in our sewers bylaw. We do have a set of stringent criteria of discharging that we measure against. But the particular issue that was raised by the deputy is a newly emerging issue, and it's actually quite large in parts of the United States, as they have a lot more military bases, as you heard. It's used in fire retardant chemicals for fighting fires. A lot of Air Force bases in the U.S. they're finding that the chemical was used, and there's some groundwater contamination. So there's a lot of research that's underway right now that Toronto Water is tracking with respect to what is occurring from a regulatory standpoint by the federal U.S. EPA and what municipal drinking water providers have to do or may have to do. There have been no changes yet to regulations, but it is being discussed, and the science is underway in looking at what the issues are. In Canada, there's a little bit of work going on, but in many cases, because we do not have a national regulator, we're all in Canada, our regulations are governed provincially. We tend to watch what happens in the US EPA and the science there while we do some of our own. So that we're tracking the issue. There are no changes proposed as of yet. There is some lobbying going on and on requiring the changes, but that has not occurred as of yet.
And so there is, I just want to be clear, there's two issues, right? So there's the one is the issue of it in the biosolids, and then the other is in our discharges.
So the bigger issue when you talk about the particular chemical that was raised within the wastewater industry is around the drinking water side first. Now, it is a closed loop system, so if you find it in drinking water, it's going to work its way into the wastewater system, both in the liquid and then as well as it's discharging out the effluent. Some of it may be captured in the biosolids. We follow all of the regulatory requirements of the province, and the province requires us to test for a variety of different chemicals in our biosolids and in our effluent, and we follow those. At this point in time, there is no specific requirement to test for additional parameters than what we're doing right now.
And likewise, just like you're following the science and what's happening in regulatory perspectives on PFAS, you're also doing that for emerging pharmaceuticals and other classes of contaminants as well?
Yeah, so we've participated as Toronto Water on previous pilot and assessments with Environment Canada, looking at the issue of pharmaceuticals and personal care products in effluent, and we've provided sample results back to the federal regulators. So we cooperate closely with the regulatory agencies if they're undertaking any scientific studies to try to develop new standards. We've done that from ammonia toxicity to chlorinated effluents all the way through personal care products. So we're in close communication with the regulators. At this point in time, this issue is just being tracked as an emerging issue, and we are aware of it as staff, but it has not yet hit the regulatory front for us to report and respond back to council to say that these are the implications to us as operators.
Thank you, Councillor McKelvey. Any other questions for staff? No? Speakers? No? Would someone like to move the recommendations? Adopt a receipt? Councillor McKelvey? Just adopting the recommendation? Councillor McKelvey? Sure. Yep. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Item number 8. Logistical and legal implications of eliminating right-of-way occupancy of private construction project and potential provision of construction management plans at rezoning stage. April Engelberg? Great, thank you much for coming.
My name is April Engelberg. I live, work, and spend most of my time in Spadina, Fort York, and was a candidate for Toronto City Council during the 2018 municipal election. So for context, for anyone in the room or watching, because we haven't gone into detail of what this agenda item is about, it's about private construction companies not taking over sidewalks and roads for years during the construction process. So I am nonpartisan. I have zero affiliation with any political party or politician, and I'm simply here to stand up for that general premise that it's gotten completely out of hand the way that Toronto allows private construction companies to take over lanes of traffic and sidewalks for years. And if you look at the staff report that was recently done addressing this issue, the excuses given are simply unsatisfactory to me. So for example, one quote says, "Eliminating the use of right-of-way for construction purposes would cause development restrictions, impact construction costs, result in longer development horizons, and cause potential health and safety concerns on certain sites." But regarding the potential health and safety concerns, the issue is constantly that construction projects are being built all the way to the property line. In other words, just the edge of the sidewalk. So that's why, for example, the sidewalk needs to be closed or the lanes of traffic need to be closed, rather than actually moving the entire development a few meters back. And then the reason why it's always going to the property line, as also stated in the report, is achieving long-term development objectives. And that's what, quote, often results in buildings either built to property lines or close to property lines.
It's not.
The report goes on to state that even if the city did elect to eliminate the occupation of the public right-of-way, it would still be utilized, since paid duty officers have the discretionary authority to close all live lanes of traffic during hoisting activities. Again, I think many of us know that a lot of construction projects don't constantly involve hoisting activities. If that's something that needs to happen on a one-off situation, again, a lane of traffic does not need to be closed for years. And I'd like to point out that even though I'm only one of 2 deputants that's here today to speak about this issue, I can assure you that many constituents in Spadina, Fort York are greatly concerned about this, because Spadina, Fort York is growing in population 4 times faster than the rest of Toronto. So on my walk to work, I personally have to have my right-of-way taken over by 4 different construction sites just to get to work. And if you look at a lot of the work the city has done recently, for example, the King Street pilot, there is now a condo construction project between Peter and John that is not only taking over the entire sidewalk, it's also taking over an entire lane of traffic. And the construction project has just started. We debate here for a long time making the Adelaide-Richmond bike lanes permanent. There's a construction project at Adelaide and Duncan that for approximately 3 years has taken over the Adelaide bike lane and moved it into the middle of the road and made it unsafe. So this is a safety concern for Torontonians, where we need to actually prioritize safety and our property being sidewalks and roads over private development conveniences. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Questions for the deputant? I just have a couple.
Thank you.
One of the biggest areas of complaints that we receive at my office is an inner suburban ward. It's not downtown, is construction companies blocking off lanes with absolutely no work going on. They put up the orange pylons. There's no workers in there. There's no equipment in there. There's no digging in there. And for a few days, that lane is blocked. Traffic is bunched up, and nothing's happening. Do you find that as well in your downtown ward?
Sure, there's times where there's a problem that it looks like they're not making the best use of time, but really what it comes down to is a safety hazard. Now, I'll give you another example. By Liberty Village, at the corner of Strawn, there are somewhere between 6 and 8 private condo construction projects happening simultaneously. Try pushing a stroller in that area. Try being somebody who needs to use a wheelchair to try to get around in that area. Or just for everybody, it's extremely inconvenient and it is unsafe.
The other thing I noticed is that the construction workers use an active lane as their personal parking lot.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
to make it even worse, they fence it off during the entire weekend to make sure those spots are available on Monday morning. Do you see that as well?
Yes, actually, I'm happy you asked that question. So as we all know, because of the King Street pilot project, there is no parking on King, except guess where? At the new condo construction project where they've blocked off a lane, and now I've noticed they've been actually parking a vehicle in that spot on King Street, where pedestrians now have to actually walk on the road instead of the sidewalk in the prime location of the pilot.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Any other questions for the deputant? No? Okay, thank you for your comments. Hamish Wilson?
Thank you. In some ways, this is a very difficult topic because I have to empathize with the builders of the many buildings going up, how difficult it is to get the volume of materials out and the number of materials in. Like the tonnages of soil and the tonnages of building material are really significant. And so, yeah, how do you manage to do that and still keep the traffic flow? So I have empathy. However, there does seem to be far too much private gain and private, profit at public expense. The right-of-ways are challenged and limited, and I've been very concerned, as I think you would know by now, over the decades about where we're getting hurt as cyclists, and with a specific focus in the core. And I don't feel that we've been responding well enough to these crash stats. And incidents, like, it doesn't have to be a serious injury to make somebody very nervous about biking. So I like to count everything as being an important concern. So there's an area, like there are areas where I think you have to be really, really much more careful and stringent about how much encroachment is allowed and for how long. These crash stats should be an indicator, especially on the main east-west roads of Queen and King and Dundas and parts of College. And going back to those stats, they didn't include the harms from the streetcar tracks. And they can be very significant. You'll have to back that off a little bit, please. These tracks are hazardous for cyclists, and I'm noticing in many areas, this area here called the margin is really, really rough and unrideable. And there are far too many locations to actually call them in. It's a systemic issue now. And so the way that things get closed off, you take the lane basically right up to this point here. And that's a real problem for cyclists. We need to have some wiggle room, like half a meter, give us 0.5 of a meter. Don't let the full lane be occupied all the time. Give us some wiggle room, especially on those streetcar track streets. So it'd be really nice to see a motion come out of here saying, yes, on the roads with streetcar tracks, bump the whole thing back. Give us safety, the actual safety of not having to cross these tracks or the increasingly dangerous margin zone, I think it is. So there's a consistent amount of endangerment, and you get the sense that with the building boom, everybody's overloaded, or there's a lack of caring, or there's a lack of, there's some erosion in the standards. This is another instance here of another major project with encroachment up at Bloor and Yonge. I've had an interest in Bloor because of the subway relief. They closed off a lane on Yonge Street, a full lane. So Yonge Street southbound is down to one lane, but on Bloor they've only closed it halfway, well, taken part of a lane. So interestingly, where the cyclist is heading, that's a very substandard lane width, only about maybe 1.7 meters, 8 feet or so. And it's been that way for a good year or so. When you add in, and right here, you'll see some signage right at the construction zone, and actually that signage should be way back to permit the cyclists to actually take the lane in comfort. I think it's possible the woman ahead of me there, ahead of the photo, in the center of the photograph there, was just missed by inches by a speeding car going through because she was trying to avoid the potholes here or the serious depressions here from construction activity that should be filled in by now. So there's a set of dangers, especially when you add in the snowbanks. We need to have wiggle room. We need to have much greater safety in these construction zones. Lower speeds, even lower speeds than what you've done. On Richmond or Adelaide, they taped over 30 kilometers an hour over a 40 kilometer. Good. Maybe down to 20, please. Make it safer. And make sure that there's actually the signage, the proper signage. And with the enforcement, it sure would be nice if the officers were actually watching the traffic rather than the construction. I totally agree with the chair about the personal parking lot aspect of some of these construction sites as well. It's pretty annoying. Yes, please do things to make it safer for pedestrians and cyclists, including cleaning things up, because bits of gravel under tires, they can go springing off into hit somebody's car, and they can actually go a bit ballistic on you sometimes if they think that you've damaged their car.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for the deputant? No? Okay, thank you very much. Questions for staff? Councillor Mallow? Oh, we're not at speakers yet. Question for staff?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So you list three things that are really the advice as to why why developers can't accommodate all loading, unloading, construction activities on their site. Construction timelines, the issues related to health and safety, and then these long-term development objectives. Is that right? I'm missing one more. I can't recall.
Through the chair, that's correct.
So what kind of health and safety things came up in your discussions? One, I should point out that the first line of the report saying following consultations with the development industry, probably that may have been best put a little bit deeper. That heavily influenced the report, because I think that's what a lot of us are really concerned about. So can you talk about those three things, the health and safety aspect? What is it about allowing for use of the public right-of-way deals with some kind of health and safety concern?
Okay, and I, through the chair, I would also encourage my team to jump in on various pieces. But the health and safety piece that is referred to here is balancing the requirements of the construction and the development requirements with the site, but also the health and safety concerns of actual construction on the site for the workers under the Ontario Health and Safety Act. And I'm not sure if that's as clearly stated as it might be, but that's definitely a significant piece. And I can have my team talk a little bit more about that. With regard to the development requirements, a lot of it has to do with zero lot line buildings, and I see the chief planner is here, and he can talk a little bit more about he's back behind you, talk a little bit about the urban design and city building priorities that the official plan refers to in terms of trying to have a continuous street wall and zero lot line buildings, which do place a significant challenge on developing those buildings, especially in tight conditions when they're quite tall. So there are those things that need to be balanced, and we look at that and try to balance that on every application. And as there's more demand and there's more construction activity that's happening, those sites are tighter and tighter, and it's getting to be a more challenging issue. So
And the last item was construction timelines. Now, I would love to ask about what kind of difference there is in relation to the amount of time, but I actually have a good example that I don't know if you're aware of or not. The lane on Bathurst Street with respect to the Mirvish Village redevelopment. They didn't need that part of the lane to build the site, but they asked for it because it shaved 2 years off construction of Mirvish Village.
And I think that's that's something certainly that we consider in terms of the overall impact. And you know, I think that there's going to be impacts in any case on every project. Some of them are much more significant than others, and where we don't want to end up going. And I know that part of the reason for this report is that there is, with the incredible growth in construction in the city, there's a lot of impact on the right-of-way and on the traveling public, which we really do try to minimize as much as we can. But what you're describing is in fact one of the things that we consider and try to minimize as much as we can.
And I don't want this to overly sound like I'm in defense of the development industry on this, because I'm not. And I want to always make sure that they're paying paying for the growth and the value of their property. But with respect to long-term development objectives, and I'm really happy that Chief Planner is here, because it has come up. Building lot line to lot line isn't always just the developer's most favorable building condition, is it? This is often what the city would like to see.
Through the speaker, certainly the long-term look and feel of the city should be driven, if you will, by our vision of how we want to build the city, and certainly not as impactful as it can be, certainly not a 2 or 3 year construction impact, which I grant you has to be appropriately managed. The long-term look and feel is about whether it be in a general way or specifically in, I know a lot of attention has been paid in the downtown and Yonge and Eglinton in this issue. Both areas have area plans where we may decide that we want to set some buildings back to widen sidewalks, for example, or create better streetscape conditions. But even in those areas, the development is as dense as it is in those urban conditions, really does not offer the opportunity to completely avoid the road occupation during construction. It's been our experience that challenge inevitably has consequences for the right-of-way. So what we've suggested in the report is certainly at the zoning stage, where we often don't have the detail that you would have later on, but at the zoning stage, at least start to surface this issue more than we have in the past and identify principles that might inform a construction management plan. And then by the time we get to site plan, and that is when you've moved away from principles into detail, and you've got a better idea of exactly what's going on and maybe even who the construction company is, that you can have a much more thorough understanding of what those impacts are. And that's been the effort recently, is to work, is to have transportation work through the right-of-way permit process ultimately to get those details as tightly defined and managed as possible. So that's kind of the continuum that we're suggesting, and the improvement that we're suggesting in the report is, at the zoning stage at least, get this issue more surface than we have in the past, understanding that we believe, in our view, our advice is that some impact on the right-of-way is going to be inevitable. We will always look for the other solutions, but there is an inevitability about this in our experience that can't be avoided.
Well, and I know that the chair was good enough to or forgot to start my clock initially, so I'll leave my questions at that.
Call it a day on that. Any other questions for staff? Councillor Cole, then Councillor Perusa.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer was. The Councillor Layton's question was, do we encourage developers to build to lot line?
So through this chair, generally we do. We even have zoning bylaws in the city that have what we call build to lines. In other words, you can only set the building back so far. And when you look across Toronto's streets, main streets, the look and feel that we want to achieve is buildings up to the sidewalks to avoid creating a sawtooth effect where some buildings are set back and some buildings are set forward. That's not the nicest streetscape that I can think of, and that's not the streetscapes that we build in Toronto. We usually bring buildings up on an entire block basis, up to the street. Understanding, as I said, that in areas like Yonge and Eglinton and in the downtown and other growth areas, we come up with specific block plans, for example, to create wider sidewalks. So we'll position a building where we think in the long term a building should be. A lot of times that is informed by creating a wider sidewalk. I just wanted to be clear that there is an inevitability about this, that positioning the building is not going to get you away from the problem of getting into the right-of-way during construction. There's an inevitability. From my experience, there's inevitability there. We've certainly experimented with different means, and transportation services have been pushing the envelope on that. And you've seen, for example, construction trailers up above the sidewalk and things like that. But I don't think pushing buildings back is going to be the answer you're looking for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Councillor Perusa?
I just want to better understand this. So we couldn't, even if we said no, prevent somebody from going on to a right-of-way if they needed it to be able to build something or fix something. I just want to know where our rights begin and end here.
Well, through the chair, I mean, anytime a developer asks for access to the right-of-way,
No, but let's just say this. Let's just say we said no. We said, no, sorry, you can't close the road, you can't come onto the road, you can't build the canopy on the road, you can't obstruct the mom with the stroller.
Through the chair, there have been a number of cases where we have said no before in the past. I think the reality is,
and then what?
Depending on the circumstances, no. It's a case where we always look at every request that comes through, and we ask, what's the nature of the construction activity that you're doing? Why do you need to have that access to the right-of-way? We challenge them to sort of see, are there other ways you can go about delivering that construction without taking access to the right-of-way? And yeah, there are occasions where we will tell them no. There are other alternatives, and to push back in that regard.
So if there's an alternative, if we believe there's an alternative, we can say no and hold them to a no.
Well, through the chair, we do, like Roger said, we do look at alternatives. But at the end of the day, for sites like this that have been approved by City Council, we're going to get to a point where there is a permit issued. It's just a matter of which conditions we're applying to that permit, right? So we go through a very rigorous exercise to figure out where the occupation could happen and for what duration.
I guess maybe I'll ask the question another way, because I just want the information. It's not to argue about it. I just want to know, if I'm going to build something and I can't build it safely or whatever other reason without going onto your property, you have to allow me to go onto your property, or you can say no.
We can say no, but we have to act reasonably in saying no. So we can.
So you can say no, but technically, if I require at the end of the day to go onto your property to build what I'm building or fix what I'm fixing, I have the right to do that, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if legal wants to weigh in on this particular question, but my understanding is, we take in an application, we review it for all the details that we need on an application, and if acting reasonably, we either issue a permit or don't issue a permit. The challenge with development sites is there's usually a city council approval of some description for that particular planning site. So is it fair to acting reasonably not to issue a permit to allow them to construct if you've gone through all the necessary steps to make sure it's done safely and you've involved all the...
All right, fine. So all the necessary steps. So So if some guy has to build something at or near the property line, and given the nature of construction today with big equipment, right? Nobody mixes concrete on site anymore, you know, like sand, gravel, shovel, right? Concrete comes in on big trucks, right? You know, mixers, right? And then those big trucks have to sort of, you know, offload their concrete onto something being hauled up by a big crane swinging overhead, right? Like, and usually swinging over the right-of-way, correct?
Yes, through the chair,
Okay.
that is correct.
So then what you want to do is you want to make sure that as they're doing that, that the people underneath or walking around underneath are safe. And that's where all of these kind of encumbrances sort of begin to take place, right?
Correct. Safety is our, biggest thing when we're reviewing these things.
Okay. So what you're really talking about is potentially sort of looking at construction activity and saying to someone who's going to build something, well, you know what? Maybe we can move the trucks now from our road, which we don't do today, I'm assuming, right? To the back of your property, right? You build the front first, you offload, and then when you build the back, yeah, you'll close the right of way for a shorter period of time. Is that really what we're talking about here?
Through the chair, I think that's correct. And some of the items that were brought up by the deputant, the first deputant, to talk about the duration of the construction. What you're just describing is a finite period of that construction, because the construction, as you know, occurs in phases. So you want to make sure, and one of the things that we do is to try to manage the phases of those construction as tightly as possible, so that the impacts on the right-of-way where they have to happen can be as short in a time duration as possible, notwithstanding what Councillor Layton brought up about if they can take the right-of-way for a little bit longer and it's ultimately going to carve a bunch of time off the total duration of the project, we're going to take that into account as well. And then just the last piece is about monitoring and auditing those sites, so that when they are no longer using the right-of-way sites for active construction, our transportation standards officers are out there enforcing those sites to pull them out and make sure that they're returning the right-of-way to the public.
Thank you, Councillor Perusa.
I think I only used up a minute and a half of my 5 minutes.
You can't bank time around here.
And bank?
No.
Can I borrow?
You can
time?
ask for a second round.
Yes, can I?
You can
ask-
borrow, but it'll cost you. You can ask for a second round, but I would vote against it.
Okay, I'm going to ask for a second round.
No, I'm going to vote against it.
Okay.
Who would
It's
like?
my area. I've got all this construction. You don't have any construction area. Like, come to Yonge and Eglinton and you'll see what.
I'll tell you what, Councillor Cole, I'll make you a deal.
I think, Mr. Chairman, you don't
Yeah.
have to take it to a vote. I think it's customary that you give second, and that's why we're a committee, right?
No, I appreciate your
If
advice.
someone has a question to ask, you want him to ask that question, right?
All right. I'll tell you what, I have a deal for you, Councillor Cole. I have a couple of questions.
You've wasted, I could have asked
And-
those
and-
questions by now.
Yeah, but we don't know how long the answer will be. I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. I can just ask a couple quick questions, and then I'll turn the floor back over to you.
You're going to ask a couple.
I have a couple quick questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much.
Going to give you some of this time.
So, I don't think it's any secret that and I mentioned it to the deputant, that the unnecessary closing of live lanes with no construction work, no workers, no equipment, no digging, no anything going on is a chronic problem. Now, what tools do we have to order these construction companies to remove these barriers and open up the lanes, at the very least, to remove them on Friday afternoon so that we have access to them all weekend?
Through the chair, I'll start, and then I think it's important to understand there are some activities. I think you're accurate in saying what is occurring out there. Certainly, in the downtown, we've tried to be quite aggressive at auditing those sites to ensure that when there is no activity happening, that we are pulling those barriers back and ensuring that they're returned to the public right of way. I think in areas where there's still construction, but perhaps less construction, we are definitely needing to be out there and on top of those constructors. And I also think there are times when those lanes are taken that it doesn't appear as if there's much activity happening, but there might be activity happening. So that's why I wanted a little bit of an overview from my staff who are out in the field on that.
Yeah, through the chair, if I can just add, just to that same point, that with the work zone coordinators and the work zone coordination team, they try to closely monitor each of the construction activities once the permits for the right-of-way have been issued to sort of understand the nature of work that's ongoing, and specifically even just driving by the sites on a regular basis to observe and see exactly those instances that you're referring to, and then reaching out to those developers to ensure whether or not they still need that space, and if they don't, basically asking them to basically remove it and provide the right-of-way. But again, to Barbara's point, there are often times where it may appear as if they've taken the lane and there's no actual work ongoing, whereas it may be a case where there's concrete below that's curing or setting, or there's all kinds of elements of construction that require where it's not safe to reopen the lane or provide access back to the public, but there's no actual physical work going on. And I think most recently within the city, there's been a bit of a campaign where we've actually been putting additional signage up saying that despite the fact there's nobody physically on site, this is kind of an intermediary stage.
All right, well, my next question surrounds the fencing off of parking spots. Either sometimes they're metered spots, sometimes not, where the workers are parking their vehicles in a live lane, and they use it as their personal parking lot during construction hours. And then I've even seen situations in which the work is done for the week, they're gone, everyone's gone. The fencing remains blocking that live lane so that those spots are available on Monday morning. Now, what action is the city taking against these shenanigans?
Yeah, so through the chair, we have actually observed the same thing, and we've been trying to ramp up our efforts specifically in the downtown core, especially to try and see if and when those opportunities, those situations arise, I should say, that we reach out to those developers and basically tell them to essentially cease and desist.
And is there compliance?
Through the chair, yeah, oftentimes, yeah. We reach out to them and basically tell them this is not the intended purpose for this use of right-of-way, and we tell them either re-provide the access or remove those vehicles. Yeah.
We also do provide issue tickets for noncompliance.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Councillor Cole, you had an additional question?
Yes, and I want to say that I do appreciate that many of you that are here have been on the road with me in the sidewalks at these construction sites. I appreciate that, and it helps when staff is there and takes that time. Don't you think what's missing here is that city staff and whether it's the building permit department, transportation, planning staff do what they have to do. But one of these construction sites is an ongoing moving target. Within a 24-hour period, there could be all kinds of conditions that change on the sidewalk, the condition of the road, the construction overhead. There may be these crazy construction pylons and signs that are everywhere. So don't we need some kind of monitoring system where someone either that's paid for by the developer or the contractor or from city staff that's basically monitoring these sites on a regular daily basis than rather on a complaint basis coming from a counselor or coming from a citizen? Don't we need some serious comprehensive monitoring of these sites to basically keep them safe? Because frankly, many of them are not safe for cyclists, pedestrians, mothers with strollers, seniors. It is like you're walking in a war zone. I mean, as I said to Councillor Nunziata, take a walk at Yonge and Eglinton, and you better have your army boots on and a helmet on. I'm telling you now, I'm asking you to walk with me. Okay, anyways, we'll walk in each other's wards. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Don't we maybe need a comprehensive person there that's supervising this on a regular basis?
Yeah, so through the chair, traditionally that role has been handled by our traffic standards officers who will generally perusing these areas and trying to identify those issues and where necessary issuing citations to the violators of that. In parallel with that, it's always been a general responsibility of the work zone coordinators as well to, especially in areas where they're aware that there's a lot of heavy construction activity ongoing, to be monitoring those areas. Most recently, back in December, we just launched our pilot of the Construction Hub Coordination Project, where taking it to a much higher level of service in that regard, where within the Yonge-Eglinton area specifically, as you're aware, we've got a dedicated project manager hub coordination who, starting from now and over the coming months, to really start taking on more and more of that kind of responsibility as well.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Councillor Cole. Yes, Councillor Nunziata?
Just one question, and not that I'm going to go to Eglinton and Yonge and take a walk with Councillor Cole.
When was the last time you were there?
Does it matter the last time when was the last time you came to my ward?
It's an exciting place now.
Okay.
Lots of funky joints.
Just a question, we're talking about development applications, but what about when the city is doing work on the roads? And some of them are going on for a couple of years, and they've got the sidewalk closed, and people are walking on the side. So in that case, well, what do we do then? Because that's closing, actually, the accessibility for anybody to walk. They're walking on the road.
Through the chair, it's the similar rules and responsibilities for public works construction in terms of they don't necessarily get a permit as per se, but they go through an internal process of review to ensure that they are only taking up those areas of the right-of-way when they actually are doing active construction. Some of the construction, like water mains and building
Lasts
sidewalks.
for years. It takes 2 or 3 years.
It does take a long time, and very often there's phases of that work that are going to impact the sidewalk, and then they're going to go into a different place, and they're going to come back and impact the sidewalk again to finish the work. So, but it's all, we do monitor it in the same way we monitor well, in a similar way to monitoring the private development.
So they apply, then they come forward and they apply for a permit as well, right?
They do not apply for a permit, but they go through a review process, and they have inspection and oversight that is provided that Michael DeAndre was talking about through ECS as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Nunziata. Any other questions for staff? No? Speakers? Councillor Matlow?
So, Chair, committee members, thank you for addressing this issue. The reason that this item is on your agenda today is based on a number of different motions that we approved to council over the past several years. Two of the items that this report really delves into that we moved a few years ago, one of which was called Taking Back Our Streets. And it addressed specifically how best we can restrict the number of lane closures and sidewalk closures that are occurring around our city that are contributing to more unsafe environments, along with increasing congestion in our city, and become impediments to all users of our right-of-way. And the other matter that I brought to council was requesting staff to look at, and I think they addressed it well in this report, if it's possible to have a better understanding of how the builder, how the developer wants to construct their project earlier in the process rather than at the back end at site plan, so that during the approval process, we can be better informed about what impact it will have on our community and our city, while we're also considering the built form and all the other rezoning considerations. So I think staff did a very good job at considering that request, and I appreciate it. On the matter of further restricting these lane closures, I say respectfully that the feedback that I have heard from staff it doesn't go as far as I would like, and I'll tell you why. I respectfully disagree with the characterization that I heard from our chief planner, who I think does an admirable job. But the characterization of inevitability, I just respectfully disagree. I also respectfully disagree that the burden of responsibility should be on us and on the public to provide for the ability for developers to build big buildings and make a lot of money. I mean, I submit to you that if you are in the development business, the burden of responsibility should be on you when you are speculating and you are considering what properties that you want to buy and then make a lot of money, that you should be able to figure out whether or not you're going to be able to develop it or not, without assuming that you have some divine right to occupy somebody else's property to stage the construction for often 2 to 3 years. That should not be the default position. So I'm not suggesting that we be unreasonable either. I recognize that there are circumstances where the impact on the public and the public right-of-way are not as adverse as other circumstances. Sometimes they're almost benign, and sometimes they're incredibly impactful. But how are we able to plan for bike lanes, for example, and then see them interrupted in the middle when a developer wants to stage on that lane? How are we able to manage the traffic flow for motorists when we don't know year after year how many lanes we're going to have to give up to the development industry? How are we able to plan for further traffic infrastructure such as BRTs if we don't know what's going to become of that curb lane? And also, you know as well as I do that when sidewalks are interrupted, we would like to see the pedestrians cross the street and use the other side, but many make other choices, including risky scenarios where they're walking in a live lane of traffic to continue on their preferred path towards their destination. We all do it. So ultimately, what I'm submitting to you through the letter that Councillor Layton has graciously said he'll take carriage of is this: to follow up on the work that staff has done to report on the motions that I moved to council. What I'm asking you to consider is this: A, that the default position is that the public right-of-way belongs to the public, and we're not in the business of just giving it over to every developer that wants to have it. That's our default position, and we need to make it very clear to the development industry. Also, that staff, and you'll see how I wrote it, that it's comprehensive through staff, that they will, I'm not saying it'll never happen again. It's not to be unreasonable. There will be circumstances that staff deem it appropriate and reasonable, and that there won't be such an adverse effect that we shouldn't support it, that it should be supported. But when it is, we should use that leverage. And you know we've got very few cards to play. Section 37, 45, DCs, they're all being rolled into a community benefit charge now. We haven't seen the regulations yet, and we don't know what kind of benefits we can gain for our communities in the long run yet. But what I want to explore, and I ask you for your support, this is a report request, by the way, to explore with staff, is there a way that if a developer is achieving more GFA by not having to set back as far as they should, frankly, to stage on their own property, then is there a way to gain a percentage of what that GFA would be and contribute it towards whether it be childcare or senior services or affordable housing on that site or nearby? Is there a way to do that? I don't know. I want to explore that. But let's use whatever leverage we have. If they're using our space, then let's see what we can get out of them for the community that is losing their lane or their sidewalk or their bike lane for 2 or 3 years. Why wouldn't we want to explore that? And finally, development is going to continue in this city. And there are some times that it's going to be landlocked and we need to adjust to that. Sometimes there are ways that they, if I may just round up,
Yeah,
slightly more
you've got quite a bonus going here, so.
I'll round it up with this if I may.
It's the first time you've come to our committee, so we're giving you a visitor bonus, but yeah, you have to wrap this up.
Then I'll wrap it up by saying thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Layton. Oh, is it being changed? Okay, anyone else to speak on the item?
Yeah.
Councillor Cole?
Again, as I've said before, I do appreciate, really, we were on the streets dealing with some of these real-life issues of safety with these major construction sites. And in some cases, we were able to talk to the construction manager on site, and they made some quick fixes. But, there's a lot of sloppiness. I'm a jogger, and I jog up Yonge Street, Eglinton, sometimes even jog up near Westlake Park in Councillor Nunziata's ward. And you know what you see on the sidewalk all the time is these leftover giant pylons, construction signs that lay there for months. I pick some up and move them over to the wall or into the alleyway because they're there for months. So that's just housekeeping. Then there's the construction companies, development that's taking place, where the sidewalks, you have these temporary barriers, for instance, with these metal feet. I know you've seen them. They sort of, they don't really bolt them down to the sidewalk, but they hold up the fences. Well, these things are a hazard, but they're all up and down our streets now. And I can imagine how many seniors and people trip over these fence feet, whatever, I don't know what the names of them. What is the name of those things I'm talking about? You know, they're supposed to be bolted into the sidewalk. They aren't. What? Yeah, but they have a foot that's metal. Feet. Anyways, that. Yeah, a variation of the above. Then there's, you know, the hoarding, the darkness. You can't see in the middle of the day. It's like going through a tunnel on Yonge Street because there's no lighting in these construction tunnels. So I just think somehow we've got to support staff in whenever planning decisions are made through approval, section 37, 42, whatever, include some of these costs that the developers will pay to keep the place in a safe working order. Right now, it's hit and miss at best. Sloppy, dark, dangerous. These are on major streets. This isn't on backwater streets where there's, you know, thousands of people that are walking, trying to get by. So I think in our approval process going forward, we've got to put in some kind of protection for people on our public streets. We'll never get rid of the construction, obviously, because they need the space to get onto the lot line. But we have to put in some safety measures. Right now, they are not safe places to be.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Any other speakers on this item? Is your motion?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I've taken carriage of Councillor Matlow's motion with one small change. I'll just go through the motion that City Council requests the General Manager, Transportation Services, in consultation with the Chief Planner and Executive Director, City Planning, to report to the Infrastructure and Environment Committee in the second quarter of 2020 with a report on implementing a new right-of-way occupancy permit policy that defaults to a denial of the request, except when no other options are available or when other factors necessitate and will require a consultation with the TTC, Transportation, and City Planning to determine whether a closure will adversely impact any current or future possible public uses of the right-of-way, including those affected pedestrians, motorists, transit users, and cyclists, and B, a percentage of the additional gross floor area achieved by the developer as a result of the city right-of-way use for construction to be provided for public amenities such as affordable housing, childcare, or senior services. First, I'd like to thank Councillor Matlow and city staff for bringing this forward and working on this issue. It's something that we struggle with in the Toronto and East York Community Council quite a bit. Just yesterday, we approved one at 2 Bloor, which I'm sure some of you have seen if you've gone on University or Avenue Road. Not 2 Bloor, sorry. This was 2 Avenue Road. They have now had 3 extensions. It's been there for 4 years or something like that. They keep asking for more and more time. I keep not giving them as much time as they're asking for, knowing that they're just going to come back, but I'm trying to make a point. I'm trying to make a point that they just can't have the space. They shouldn't be just entitled to it. And in this case, it's the sidewalk, but there's no sidewalk extended out into the road. So it would have been taking of the road if we replaced the sidewalk. Unfortunately, that wasn't the agreement that was reached prior to me taking on the file. The use of public right-of-way by developers is a constant annoyance of residents in the city of Toronto. So it's no surprise that it's often the target of folks in the media, of politicians, all of us, of members of our community as to why we're seeing such enormous congestion issues in the city. It's no surprise. But as we heard from the chief planner and we see in the report, it is sometimes a necessity. Not all the time, but sometimes. And sometimes, yeah, sure, it benefits the developer. They get to go to market quicker with their units. They get to sell it faster, make their money quicker. It's probably a little easier to build their project. They might be able to build a little bit more because they're building to the lot line. But that's not always the only motivator or the only reason why they're ending up in that position. Sometimes, as our chief planner said, we want them to build to the lot line so that you don't have one building on Eglinton at the sidewalk width and then one situated 4 meters further back. Sometimes we do want new housing units built in the city of Toronto. When we have a housing emergency like we do, or the situation we do in the city, we want to help get these buildings built faster. It's not just the developers that want to see that. In Mirvish Village, I've closed a lane of Bathurst consciously with the enthusiastic support of many in my community because it shaves 2 years of construction time off of what will now be a 5-year project. We wanted that. And yes, West Bank makes money faster. But we get 900 rental units, 100 of which are affordable faster too. There is a little bit of give and take here. But I think where Councillor Matlow wants to go with this, and I'll just try to sum up quickly here, where I think Councillor Matlow wants to go with this is that it can't always seem like we start at a position favorable to developers. Because I think that's how a lot of people feel, whether or not it's intentional, and I don't believe it's intentional. I don't believe we, in fact, do that because I've seen some of the give and take that goes on. I think that there's a perception of that. I think the communities need to know that we have their best interests and concerns top of mind, and not only those of the developers. And I think we do that by starting at a place of denial and having it need to be demonstrated to us that there's a need for this, both from a developer's perspective, around the site constraints, but also that it benefits the community in the end. So I struggled with this for a little bit, but where I landed on Councillor Matlow's motion is, I think, something that I can support. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Layton. Councillor Perruzza?
Yeah, I'm going to support the essentially the staff recommendations that are in front of us today, and I get it. I understand some of the problems connected to this, and we've all experienced them firsthand. And my real pet peeve is the private developers and the rest of it. That's a problem, but it's the real culprits are when we do the big public projects, the subways and the LRTs and those kinds of things. And they just come along, they sort of take properties as of right, they shut it down, they move barriers in the middle of roadways, don't move them, and we've chatted about that over time, but that's not. I think we need to be a little more vigilant, but I don't believe we're ever going to have the resources to police this properly, or in fact to create those construction schedules that people are talking about creating. Because at the end of the day, it's a far more complex world than we would otherwise believe here. But having said that, I do want to say this. I don't understand why it is that we would encourage, or in fact, in most cases, force developers to build their first floor to the lot lines. I've never understood this. Like, why would we, from a planning perspective, not encourage sort of a public realm covered space where, A, you create a greater sidewalk width. But B, as the city develops and you get more and more pedestrians and you get more people on sidewalks, you create more sidewalks and covered space. So many of you will have noticed, you walk on Bay Street down here, for example, and now they have signs that say overhead ice, right? So you're walking by a building that's basically on the lot line, a very narrow sidewalk between the curb and the building on Bay Street, and you got signs saying you got chunks of ice that are going to drop on your head. Look up, dummy. Right? That's not, to talk about, falling windows and all of the rest of it. I get it. Great planning, principle. Let them build out to the lot line. But why we wouldn't say to them, not your first floor. Reset your first floor, create a public realm, and then you can come out on your second floor so that people have something safe to walk under, so that ice doesn't drop on their brain. I understand that that's more of a planning argument, and I should perhaps maybe go to planning committee and speak to that. But you've seen some of those buildings we all love, by the way. Where you have these columns that come out to the lot line, anchoring the second floor, but you got these like wide, kind of like boulevard area that sometimes are used for public amenities outdoors, but you're walking in a covered space. Why we wouldn't promote the creation of that type of city, where people can move around safely, sheltered, shaded, and without having chunks of ice drop on their head, creating much wider sidewalks. Like, why we wouldn't do that is beyond me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perruzza. Are there any other speakers on this item? No, thank you, Councillor Perruzza. Are there any other speakers on this item? Okay, I guess not. That's good. So we have one motion for this item, on item number 8. It is currently on the screen. All those in favor?
I think it's, Councillor Matlow would like to see a recorded vote here, so I'll indulge him by making that request.
All right, a recorded vote.
Any of you asked for the same, I'd do it, so.
All those in favor of the motion on the screen, Councillor Cole, Councillor Layton, Councillor McKelvey, Councillor Pasternak. Any opposed? In favor includes Councillor Perruzza. Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously.
Okay, the item is amended.
No, you don't need that. We're good.
Okay. Item number 9, Councillor Cole, you held that. Well, 9 is next. Why? You're here for item 10? Thank you. Councillor Cole, can we dispose of this quickly? Is there a reason you're holding it, or?
Well, yes, there's about 5 years of reasons why I'm holding this. This is exactly what Councillor Layton was just referring to. We keep getting extensions for taking up the public sidewalk on Yonge Street. We gave 1 extension, 2 extensions, I think. Now they're asking for another one. And, ironically enough, the name of the developer is Lifetime Developments. It sure is Lifetime Developments. It seems they're going to be developing this project here on Yonge Street for a lifetime. And so the question, I have a couple questions of staff about this Lifetime Development. If I could ask staff? Okay, Chairman?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yes, in terms of this, the extension they've asked for now till April 2021, we gave them one. How many extensions have we given Lifetime here?
Yes. Where is it?
Through the chair, this would be the second, yeah.
the second extension. When did this project start? Okay.
February 1st?
The site has been in place since February 1st, 2018.
So it's the 2018, we're 2, 3, how many years is going to go on? Anyways, it's been going on for a number of years here. And do they expect to be finished by April 30th, 2021? Will this be the last one they've asked for?
Through the chair, my understanding is they have, they're on the 21st floor of their construction. They've got 12 floors remaining. They plan to remove their tower crane in the spring of 2020. They'll do their streetscaping on Yonge and Hellendale in the fall of this year, and then they'll be doing interior work and finishing until April of 2021.
So I guess I could therefore put an amendment here that a motion that this is the last extension you get. Okay, anyways, but this is, thank you for this is, if I may just speak to it briefly, this is why what we've just been talking about is the perfect example here on Yonge Street with nonstop construction, with the building of the Eglinton Crosstown Lifetime Project that's been going on for 30 years, and not to mention the attempt of people to try walking Eglinton. Well, Councillor Nunziata knows full well when we started to build this subway in 1990. So it's been, 20, 30 years now of construction on Eglinton, along with the construction on Yonge Street. Oy vey, I don't know when it's going to stop. So that's what the people are saying is, they're patient. They want subways. They want construction. But 30 years of it, and then extensions and extensions. So if I could just move an amendment that this be the last extension given to, in their lifetime, for lifetime developments for the project at 2360 Yonge Street.
Okay, so do you want to prepare that with
Yeah,
staff?
and then we'll hold it down until I prepare my amendment.
Okay. Any other speakers? Okay, so then we'll move to the next item. So 11:10, and there are deputations. Hamish Wilson.
Thank you again.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Yes. Theoretically, this is good news, or could be. And so it's nice to see. However, been there in some ways. This is from 1998, I think, cycling trail opportunities in rail and hydro corridors. And we've had this, that was kind of what they came up with as, first round, second round sort of things. I'm not sure how much was done. And it's good, there's no doubt about it at times, but at the same time, I think we should be focusing on the on-road safety, which is still a set of issues, including, say, on Bloor Street East, where there's a keystone gap that was in the 2001 bike plan, and it's still not done, despite the repaving, and despite the commitment to study, it's still a gap. So I favor the on-road rather than off-road. Because the on-road is usually cheaper to be done, and it's where commuters are going rather than the recreational. So by doing the off-road as a priority, it tends to eat up the bike budget and not necessarily benefit the cyclists as much as I'd like to see happen. And quite honestly, the best use, the highest best use for some of these linear corridors, many of them, is for transit, not necessarily for biking. And that's a sore point with some cyclists, perhaps, but absolutely when the space gets really contested as we get to the core, that's the highest best use. And there are two areas that I'd like to suggest should be really highest best use for transit. One is the Rail Trail Weston corridor here, and also up here. Actually three. This is now a rail trail in Councillor Robinson's ward. And then there's the Gatineau corridor, although there's tons of space out there, and that would be a logical place for a transit way. With the Weston corridor, this goes back to merely 1985 or so. You can see that the rail line was suggested for transit. And that's good. That's what the UPX was such a sad waste of resources. We need the sub-regional fast transit more than we do the milk runs. And even though the rail trail is a wonderful resource to bike on, it feels safe, it isn't as needed as surface relief. The pressure on this corridor gets even more intense south of Queen because there's all this demand that comes in from the west and from Etobicoke. My hope, some year, some decade, trying to compromise, we have a new idea of stacking the transit on the north side of this corridor. So we have the sub-regional TTC under any RER or GO, so that the Queen car can be advantaged as a loop, a one-way reversible loop like Jarvis, down to Front Street, then back on Queen or King, and then in the afternoons head out. Because some year we've got to actually improve the transit in the core, and I think this is one of the keystone links for transit. Come back next year perhaps, and I know transit's a very sore point with all of us because of the changes that have been forced upon us by the province. So yes, absolutely, it makes some sense sometimes to get the rail trails, the off-road happening. I just wish that we would focus on the on-road. The off-road isn't necessarily as safe for women, by the way, so there's an equity issue as well. Because they tend to be more remote, they aren't necessarily as safe. So yes, plenty of gaps on the on-road bike network, and I would really hope that we could actually fill those in first, please.
Thank you. Any questions for the deputant? Okay. Any questions on the item?
I just have a question to staff. So in your report, as far as the West Toronto Rail Path, page 6 of 10, so which there's been a number of motions that have gone through council in the past few years on that when the line went through my ward, Weston, and it's going northbound to Guns Road, Union Street. So we did move motions asking Metrolinx that because right now they're going through the study and they're doing the electrification study, right, on electrifying the train. And so it's my understanding that they're going through the process now, and that's what I was told by Metrolinx. So in the report, it says that the city has requested Metrolinx to accommodate the rail path within the corridor as part of their electrification design. Do we know where it is at this point? I want to make sure that they do actually look at that during the design period, because it's my understanding they're doing that now. I just don't want to miss the opportunity here, because this is something that's been ongoing for a few years. And I know it's Councillor Bala it goes through her ward, and I believe Councillor Cressy, Councillor Layton, it goes Councillor Cressy's ward too, right? Yeah.
Through the chair, through the section north of the existing rail path, we worked with Metrolinx on if there were opportunities to extend the rail path through the St. Clair Transportation Master Plan. And at that point, there weren't opportunities there within the rail corridor. And so we looked at on-street alternatives to provide still a all ages and abilities safe facility. But through the electrification process, yes, we've asked them to look at that. I don't have an update on where it is, and we'll certainly look into that and get back to you.
Yeah, could you please, because it's my understanding that they've started this process. I was at a meeting a couple months ago, and that's what we were told. I just want to make sure that we're on top of this, and that we don't let it, go by and not have the opportunity to give input.
Absolutely, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Any other questions for staff? Anyone to speak on the item? Would someone like to move it? Councillor Layton, all those in favor? So what do we need to move?
Just move receipt.
So sorry, Councillor Layton, would you like to move receipt?
That sounds good.
Sounds great. Okay, all those in favor? All those opposed? Carries. The next item is, do you want to go? We're going to continue forward in the agenda and go back to 11.9 when that motion is prepared. So next up is 11.12. And there is a deputation from Sam Perry. Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
My name's Sam Perry. I work for Culture Link's Bike to School project. We provide cycling education to schools in Toronto, and since 2013, we've engaged over 37,000 students. The Bike to School project supports this report, improving road safety of school-aged children. The city's focus and resources need to be directed toward arterial roadways, not collectors and local streets. In the last 5 years, more than 80% of collisions in which school-aged children were killed or seriously injured occurred on arterial roadways. We urge you to prioritize resources toward making Toronto's arterial streets safer. One way you could do this is by implementing automated speed enforcement devices, which by rule must be implemented near schools on arterial roadways. Your initial rollout of the 50 ASE devices, 2 per ward, fails terribly in this regard. Of the 50 devices, 0 will be implemented on major arterials, 6 will be implemented on minor arterials, and 44 or 88% will be implemented on collectors and local streets. So 88% of these devices are being implemented on streets where KSI collisions are much rarer. It doesn't have to be this way. We know from this report that the city recently reduced speed limits on 149 kilometers of arterials that pass within school zones and thus are eligible for ASE devices. These arterials near schools are ideal locations to implement ASE. These devices will be relocated every 3 to 6 months, so we urge you to prioritize ASE implementation on arterials before the next relocation. This is just one way that resources for schools can have the type of meaningful impact that this report calls for. We know how to make our streets safer for school-aged children. Focus on arterials, reduce speed limits, implement complete street designs, and enforce traffic laws. On behalf of all Toronto students trying to bike, walk, and roll to school safely, the Bike to School project urges you to please focus the city's attention and resources on Vision Zero interventions that will have a meaningful impact that will make our most dangerous streets safer for school-aged children and all Torontonians. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Deputant? Councillor Cole?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making a deputation on this very important safety issue. And I will be moving a motion a little later asking for exactly what you've called for, and that is you've called for the prioritization of the speed cameras on major arterials, right?
Correct.
And why should that be the case?
So as stated in this report, the majority of serious injury and deaths that are occurring in Toronto are happening on these major arterials. So even though there's far fewer kilometers of them, they are the locations where the most serious collisions are happening. So we need to target those areas.
Yes, and I guess, I don't know if you're familiar, I've got the most dangerous school crossing in my area is on Avenue Road, Allenby School. Teachers have been hit, kids have been hit, people on sidewalks. And mysteriously, it was not chosen as a site for one of these safety cameras. Are you familiar with Avenue Road at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you know there's that dead man's curve there just before it. Mm-hmm. And another school, I have a granddaughter at Runnymede Public School on Runnymede. Again, I, for the life of me, can't understand why that isn't a school safety zone, why that isn't assigned for a speed camera. I guess there's so few, there's only 50 of them. So anyways, I just think that, or can you please again talk to about the reality of safety on these major arterials for pedestrians, cyclists, whoever it may be?
Right. So I think that it's a myth that most schools in Toronto, or that all schools in Toronto, are are located on these quiet streets. Many schools are located on or near these large arterials. And so kids are facing very real challenges in either traveling along these arterials or trying to get across them, whether we're talking about walking or biking or using a scooter or any device. These kids need to be safe using these large streets, and we need to use a variety of tools that we have in order to make that happen. And as I outlined, the very small number of cameras that we have are not being allocated strategically. Only 12% are on arterials, and those arterials are minor arterials. They're not Avenue Road, and they're not Runnymede. So when you're in a situation where you have few resources, I think it's even more important to allocate them strategically.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the Deputant? Okay, thank you for coming. Any questions for staff? Councillor Cole?
Yeah, I guess the question I have for staff, what are the problems with trying to prioritize major arterials for locations for the speed cameras?
So through the chair, we're looking at all locations for automated speed enforcement. We prioritize based on the greatest need, not just based on the road classification type. So the sites that were selected initially, those were the sites that had the highest need. And also, we've talked about potential conflicts with specific sites. So to the point about why are we not higher currently, there may have just been conflicts with things like construction, signage, things of that nature that prevented us from going with a few more on arterials on this initial deployment cycle.
What do you mean by conflicts?
So through the chair, if there's construction that's occurring, if there's not the required signage in place at this time, if there's inadequate space or locations for the devices to be placed, those are the types of conflicts that may exist right now that we would have to work through in our next relocation cycle.
Okay, I know you only have 50 that have been allocated. Is that 50 because of lack of funding? If you had more monies allocated, would you install more than 50 of these speed cameras?
So through the chair, 50 was the number that was approved by council. I think if we were to increase that number, we'd have to look at the feasibility of doing so, the impacts to the program. And given that it's the launch of the program, 52 per ward was a good way to start to sort of evaluate the program effectiveness.
The other thing I just would add there, Councillor, through the chair, is that the nature of these cameras where we are able to move them on a rotation, I think what we found from other jurisdictions is there tends to be a drop-off effect after a certain period of time. And so while we only have 2 cameras per ward, we aren't going to keep them in the same place for the duration. So we really get more coverage. And to Mike's point, as we grow the program, similar to with red light cameras, we would come back and ask for more capacity in the future.
But just in terms of, yeah, I've sort of got conflicting information here, saying that basically we don't want more than 50. Like, wouldn't it be beneficial to try and just change the, you might say, the sort of attitudes of people by having these cameras in more locations so we could start issuing tickets and getting the message out that you can't speed near schools. So I don't see the downside of putting in 100 cameras.
Through the chair, so there are a number of, I don't want to call them administrative because they're very important components of the automated speed enforcement program that, the back end, if you will, that does make it, I believe, more beneficial to start with a smaller number and ensure that we have all the protocols correct and that we're able to address the management of the ticketing, that we're able to do a appropriate warning letters that were basically able to start up the system. And we had the same process with red light cameras, where we rolled out, I think, 74 sites to start. We got all the bugs out of the system, and then we doubled the program, and now we're doubling it again. So I think we have every reason to believe it's going to be a very successful deployment. We have lots of partners that we're working with here, some of which have some concerns, many of which are quite enthusiastic. We know the community wants more, and we want to deliver it, but we believed that the best way to launch was to start with a reasonably sized deployment and then move the cameras around within those wards to those hotspots so that we could get the best coverage that we could. And then we would come back to you with other requests for expansion in future years.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the problem is a result of the complications arising from the province having to basically dictate the terms of, collecting fines and issuing fines. And so, but for the first 3 months, I guess, is just warning letters that they'll get?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McKelvey, questions for staff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff, for preparing this. I know we had asked for it because residents were really frustrated with how long it was taking to roll out the school zones, and it's very nice because now we have a report that has everything you're doing in one spot, which is very helpful because it was hard to piece all of that together and see that big picture. So thank you for that. The second part of that motion, though, where we put in this request was asking if there was anything that could be done to improve project management, because in my community, my street was resurfaced and repaved in July, and then in front of the public school was resurfaced and repaved in September. And it could have just as easily have been switched, because it wouldn't have been a problem to pave in front of my house and on the residents at that time. So is there anything that can be done about this so that we're better coordinating the timing of construction and the order that we're doing the city streets? Because that was really what inflamed residents and got this conversation going. So I noticed you're not reporting on that here, and maybe it's coming at another time, or maybe you can speak to that.
Through the chair, yes, we certainly can improve the way we roll out the programs. The intention and the direction is to not do work in front of schools in September. And this particular situation was a good learning as to what can happen when schedules slip. We did have some slippage of schedules this year, and I believe this site was one of those that we did want to try to get it done as quickly as possible because the safety improvements were important, but it did slip, the calendar did slip. Do you have something else you want to say about that?
I think, as we talked about in a previous meeting, but just so it's on the public record as well, the nature of the contracts for the local road program have changed in the way they're written to address the timing of projects not happening during the startup of the school season especially, and focusing the work over the summer months when it's less busy in those neighborhoods. In terms of a report back, there was an option to bring it forward as part of a report that didn't come forward at that time, so we'll have to look at which report it would come back in a more formal way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McKelvey. Any other questions for staff? Councillor Layton?
Thank you very much. I'm still a little unclear on when determining the ASE locations. How is it that we didn't end up with any on arterial roads?
So through the chair, our information is that we have 7 of the 50 cameras on arterial roads. Furthermore, as I said, it is decided by a data-driven process, as well as a further site investigation and confirmation that we can place the equipment at those locations. So we've got 7 cameras on arterial roads currently. Again, we may be looking at the feasibility of expanding that in the future, but there may be opportunities in the future to do that.
But when we did our initial scan of all the locations based on the KSI and where we established that need would be the greatest, it ended up with these 7 on minor arterials.
Through the chair, that's correct.
If you might recall through the chair, the first phase of this was the designation of community safety zones, because we can only deploy the automated speed enforcement cameras in community safety zones. We did an assessment, I believe, in 2018 and into 2019 to establish those community safety zones. They all include school frontages, but they go beyond the 150 meters in front of the school. We were somewhat limited in how far we could expand those zones, and so we did try to pick up as many of the arterials as we could.
How are we limited in that way?
I believe the provincial legislation requires us to place these cameras in community safety zones.
But the boundaries of the community safety zone, how are they set?
So through the chair, we tried to recreate essentially school zones through the community safety zones to basically mimic, but at the same time allow a little bit of additional flexibility. For example, in a location where you would have multiple schools along the same road, instead of having gaps of a community safety zone, we would expand that to be one larger community safety zone. As well, to Barbara's point, it's important to note that of the existing 831 eligible community safety zones that exist, 17% of those are on arterial roads, and that basically matches the distribution that we have currently of where the cameras are for arterials versus non-arterials.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Layton. Any other questions for staff? Speakers? Yep, Councillor Cole.
I'd just like to put this up on the screen. Too bad Councillor Nunziata isn't here any longer. But just giving some context to my frustration with this. There's a guy in the corner behind me there too. So this is a context here of my frustration with the getting technology to make our roads safer. And so this is a campaign.
Was that 1990 when you were raising against red light cameras?
No, I introduced the legislation to bring in provincial legislation for red light cameras. You voted against it, remember?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so this is where we put up the first red light camera at Lawrence and Western Road. You can see the Mayor Nunziata and Lastman, Jack Layton, and myself were putting this. So this has been a long fight to get the city and the province enter the 21st century in terms of dealing with pedestrian safety. So that's why I'm very glad that we're proceeding with the automated speed enforcement cameras, which have been long time coming, and it's not the fault of the city so much, it's the fault of the provincial government that no matter what stripe, they've always been opposed to change or to technology. They told me at the time when we did the red light cameras, they said we should have a cop in every corner to monitor people running red lights. That's what they wanted. They said, we don't need cameras, we need more cops on the intersections. Anyways. So just to get back, I have a motion I'd like to put up on the screen. Just a few years, that's all. Okay, the motion I have up here is for two requests that going forward, if we could ensure that the local councillor is consulted prior to the cameras being installed. And I know that we've been told we're going to be consulted after the fact, that the 50 are already in, but I think, you know, we just can't be slaves to the analytics on this. We need to talk to the councillors because we're in constant conversation with the people that live in the area, that know the area, with the principals, with the crossing guards. So I think it's important going forward that the local councillors be consulted prior to the decision of where these cameras go so you can have our input. Secondly, related to the deputant that just brought forward, I think we should look at the possibility of giving some priority to our major arterials because they are the most dangerous schools, and I think there's more than just data that determines the danger on these major arterials. The speed, you know, on Avenue Road, for instance, they are going, in fact, we had the test cameras on Avenue Road. We clocked somebody 120 kilometers an hour. The greatest number of speeders where they had the test cameras were in the Avenue Road location. Then I find out that Avenue Road wasn't chosen as one of these, the people were just flabbergasted. Says you're not putting a camera at Allenby School. So I think going forward, we have to look at the major arterials more seriously as one of the ingredients in determining where these cameras go, and we should also consult the local councillor. But anyways, I want to thank staff for this report. It's been very frustrating for them too because of all the hoops they've had to go through with the province on this, because fundamentally they were not in support of camera technology. I was there when they voted 320 amendments against the cameras going in. So they didn't really want them, but they were forced by citizens to do something about it. So we have them, and we've got more work to do, but at least we are starting to implement technology rather than having a cop at every school. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Any other speakers on the, Councillor Layton?
Thank you very much, and I'll be very brief. I don't have a motion or anything like that. I'd just like to thank staff for bringing this forward. I would have liked to see, as part of B of the original request for this report, is having those different options of what we could do to improve, or here's the range of things we could do to improve. Because as it appears to me, some of these things are going to come back as part of a budget ask in future years, and that's when we're going to have that debate. Unfortunately, when we put issues like this into the debate, the overall budget debate, it tends to get lost, the necessity of us furthering our investment and adding to that investment. And so it's often useful to present us with costed options at stages like this when all of our attention is focused on those things, and we can ask them to be included in the budget or direct staff to include them in the budget. I think what it did, though, and it like maybe I was caught in with many people who sort of rushed to look at protections in school safety zones and spending our money as quick as we can in school safety zones. Like, I think it's a natural feeling that a lot of us have to try to protect the most vulnerable is, let's go to where they are. Let's go to the school safety zones. That's where we have to be. But what this report has outlined is, you know what, if you want to protect those vulnerable road users, it's not necessarily school safety zones where you need to be. And that's probably one of the shortcomings of the automated speed enforcement in general, and how it's not going to have the effect that we want to see it have because it's restricted to those areas. We might have to make those areas more reflective of the playground, the travel pattern of those vulnerable road users in order to protect them at the end of the day. And if you read between the lines, expand those school zones so we can apply these cameras where they might have more of an effect on major arterial roads where people are actually dying and getting really hurt. And that's clear from the first page in the report. And but I don't think it's something that comes naturally to people to say, you know what, to protect school-age kids, we don't necessarily need to be spending all of our money at schools. We should be spending them on large, dangerous roadways, because that's what's going to actually make a difference at the end of the day. I would say a comment was made earlier that the ASCs weren't being located strategically, and I think that's a bit unfair to staff. partly because when the locations came out, I saw them and I said, my community's going to start calling me and complaining about the locations. But you know what? I didn't choose where they are. And I don't love the notion that councillors are going to be consulted on where they're going to be, because we're not the ones that probably actually know where they should be best. That's going to be our professional staff. And I saw what staff, because I immediately sent, I think I sent it to staff, it may have been my own internal team, to say, how are these locations chosen? I know I'm going to get asked. And I was sent just a snapshot into what they went through. They were very strategic, hyper strategic, and they're locating these cameras. And so while I appreciate the second point of Councillor Cole's motion, and I would be supportive of that, and given it's a report request, I'll let the first part slide. I just don't need to be consulted about the locations. I think that I think that the shortcoming in the ASE piece is that we've limited it to, or it is limited to, the school zones and not been put in areas where it actually might make more of a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Layton. Any other speakers on the item? No? So we just have the one motion. I'll put it on the screen. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Now, I understand that number 9 was held down. Councillor Cole, do you have a motion for that? I understand you've withdrawn your motion.
Satisfied.
Yeah? All right, so I think we're ready to... okay, so can I have someone just move the recommendations and we're done with number 9? I will move the recommendations. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. I can also quickly release, if the committee agrees, number 20, which is really a report back on how we can preserve some of the green space at the Dufferin Transfer Station. And we can get that one done. It was a walk-on item, if everyone's okay with that. Yeah? It's number 20. It's a report back on how we can save some of the green space at the Dufferin Transfer Station. I want to move it. I just want to release it.
Save the green space. Dumb.
Save the green space. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So now I think we jump back to item 15. Feasibility of implementing local traffic vehicle decals. We have a deputant, Miroslav Glavik. Oh, he didn't want to wait the 6 hours for this opportunity. Well, all right. Well, he's missed a golden opportunity on this wonderful idea. Any questions for staff? But I'm not sure whether we want to waste any more time on this one.
Oh, I'll move the staff recommendations.
Okay, thank you. To put us out of our misery. Staff recommendations moved. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Okay, so number 16, it was actually held by Councillor McKelvey. Smart Commute Program Transition.
I have a motion. If nobody has questions, we can proceed with it.
If you have a motion, did anyone else have questions for staff or want to speak on it other than Councillor McKelvey to move her motion? You're good? Okay. Okay, well, Councillor McKelvey, why don't you move your motion?
So the motion is that the Director of Energy and the Environment evaluate the feasibility of enhancing smart commute by through discussions with other navigation providers, so that we can look at how we can have carbon tracking and measurement tools, and how we can look at more multimodal sequencing of trips, and that there's a report back in the fourth quarter of 2020. So basically what the vision here is there's all these calorie counters that happen right now, and people look at, I can eat this or I can eat that, and then they can work out and they can say, I saved 300 calories today, and they put out a tweet. Yay. Can we do the same sort of thing with commuting? I walked and saved X amount of carbon. But not only that, moving forward, and I think we can do that with, Google Maps, and we can do that with Waze, because right now they will calculate your trip times with different modes of transit. Can we get them to take it a step further and say what the carbon is associated with that? So people can start to think about the impacts of their travel in a different way, much like they think about eating. When they start to use these calorie counters. But the other thing I think we need to pay more attention to, and it came forward through some of the Transform TO consultations that I attended, is that we tend to think of commuting and travel as one mode of transit only. You're either on the bus the whole way, or you're walking the whole way, or you're driving the whole way. But for many residents, especially in the suburbs, you may drive to a TTC stop or drive to a GO train stop, and then you'll take transit, and then you may walk. So those Google Maps and Waze and things like that aren't great at splitting up trips into different components. So I've just asked staff that they can look at the feasibility of this, start some discussions, make a recommendation if this is something that could be done, and maybe ideally through partnership with others that work in that space, in that technology space, so that we can maybe look at our carbon a little bit differently. I love it. Calorie carbon.
All right. All right, any other speakers on the item? No, we're good? Okay, there's the motion on the screen. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And the item is amended. There's staff recommendations. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So we're on to item number 17, and we have a number of deputations. Stuart Lyons of Bird Canada. Great, thank you for coming, and thank you for your patience. It's been a long day.
Turn this on. Mr. Chair and committee members, my name is Stuart Lyons, and I'm the president and CEO of Bird Canada. Bird Canada is a Toronto-based, Canadian-owned company that offers Canadians the most innovative last-mile mobility solutions for urban areas. Last year, we launched a dockless e-scooter sharing program in Calgary, Edmonton, and Montreal. And this year, we look forward to launching additional cities, including Toronto, in the spring of this year. I've appreciated the opportunity to meet many of you individually, and I'm grateful to appear before the committee today. As you know, as of January the 1st, the Ontario government has removed the principal obstacle to this launch of dockless e-scooter sharing, and city staff are preparing a report on e-scooter sharing for this committee's consideration. And I look forward to appearing before you again in March when that report is completed. And in the interim, I wanted to briefly comment on the electric vehicle strategy. I want to commend the report's authors for including shared mobility in general and electric micromobility in particular as part of the range of available actions to help the city achieve its laudable 2050 goal of having all transportation powered by zero-carbon energy sources. In order to meet this goal, at least two things have to happen, in our opinion. One, people will have to replace gas-powered vehicles with electric vehicles, obviously. And two, the number of trips taken by motor vehicles in our city overall will have to be reduced. Dockless e-scooter sharing will be a significant contributor to both of these objectives. I say this for two reasons. First is because electric light vehicles can materially assist a city in meeting emission reduction targets. And secondly, because data consistently shows that every 3 e-scooter trips replaces 1 car trip. And even last month's report from the City of Calgary on its experience with dockless e-scooter sharing revealed the exact same result. I'd like to draw your attention to a study by Carbone 4, a leading French consulting firm that specializes in carbon strategy. Some of you already have a copy of this Paris-focused report, which concluded that light electric vehicles can help cities meet decarbonization goals. Based on the current mode split in Paris, Carbone 4 examined 3 exploratory scenarios to determine the potential for dockless LEVs and e-scooters especially to meet future mobility needs and mitigate carbon emissions in the long term around 2030. These analyses found that biking and LEVs could feasibly account for around 21% of all trips in Paris, supporting an overall reduction of emissions for energy consumption of 68%. For these reasons, it's clear that light electric vehicles, such as e-scooters, represent an important contributor to the City of Toronto's decarbonization goal. And I'm pleased that this report before the committee today recognizes the complementary nature of e-scooters. I encourage this committee to do the same. Bird Canada looks forward to working with this committee, city staff, and other stakeholders as the city prepares for the launch of e-scooter sharing in Toronto later on this spring. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you very much. Questions for the deputy? Okay, thank you very much. Brian Purcell, Atmospheric Fund. Brian Purcell.
I think he submitted a written document, deputation.
Okay. Chris Schaefer, Lime, Canada. Thank you for coming. You have 5 minutes.
I work for a tech company, so let's see if I can get this laptop hooked up so you can see the presentation. I'll do it old school.
We're good to go?
Yeah, we're not getting the visuals, so I apologize, but I can send along the presentation afterward.
Sure.
So my name's Chris Schaefer. I'm Senior Director Strategic Development at Lime in Canada. Today I wanted to talk about the EV strategy. Obviously, as my friend at Bird mentioned, that there's a report coming before the committee later this quarter on potential regulation for e-scooter share operations after the province permitted that where municipalities wish to have them. So I won't talk about that. That's something for later, but I did want to touch on briefly the EV strategy, particularly electric scooters. The Atmospheric Fund had a report out recently, and it highlighted the unfortunate reality of some transportation emissions increasing on a per capita basis across the GTA and in Toronto. As we know, transportation is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions that you're all very familiar with. So there's a need in here, which I'll talk about very briefly, is to mode shift, get more people out of cars and onto other forms of sustainable transportation that do two things: don't contribute to traffic congestion, and are also electric, so environmentally friendly. In the Transform TO under transportation, one of the goals is 75% of all trips under 5 kilometers will be walked or cycled. I'd add rolled to that as well. And that sort of multimodal universe in which we're increasingly living, citizens here and residents of the City of Toronto, which I am as well, looking for different ways to get in and around their cities. And scooters, I think, can play a small role, but a role nonetheless in advancing the EV strategy and the climate change emergency concerns we have here in the City of Toronto and Transform TO as well. How is Lime addressing its environmental work and the sustainability of its products? 4 things I'll highlight very briefly. We're continuing to strengthen the durability of our e-scooters to extend their operational lifetime. The longer they last, the better it is for the environment. There's also the modularity of the components of our scooters. So we can use different parts to repair and replace aging parts in other scooters. Our newest models of scooters are now lasting over a year, which is a marked improvement from the initial scooters that were launched by companies 3 years ago, which weren't lasting as long. Our newest scooters that we've launched globally, about 96 to 97% of the parts are recyclable as well. Another item I'll highlight very briefly, there's others, but is the mode shift element that I'll talk about very briefly. The last thing is that where there are less environmentally friendly components of our operation, such as the rebalancing of scooters, where we don't do that by bicycle and human power, where we use vans that might run on diesel. We use carbon offsets. So our entire fleet of electric scooters is charged with 100% renewable energy, and we use carbon offsets where we need to. As my friend highlighted, Calgary, Edmonton, and Montreal, we were operational in Lime last year. City of Calgary was the first city to produce a rather thorough report on e-scooter operations in their city. They found 1 in 3 Calgary e-scooter trips replaced a trip with a car. Again, that mode shift is important, as we need to shift more people out of cars into other forms of environmentally friendly transportation. So we're seeing real impact from scooters in Canada to date. Again, when I share this presentation with committee members, you can't see it now, I've got just my last slide here, and I'll wrap up, is I get to pull data for any city, but I've pulled data here from Paris, France. We have a scooter operation in Paris, France, and it maps the TomTom's company in traffic congestion index with Lime trips throughout the day and week. So Monday, starting in the morning to evening. So you're looking at rush hour traffic congestion patterns, and the pattern of our daily Lime trips on our scooters matches. As traffic congestion increases, so does the use of our scooters. So you're seeing a nice sort of trade-off as people are mode shifting during rush hour and high periods of traffic congestion. I think that's important as well. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, committee, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for the deputant? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gabriela Kalapas.
Hi there, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you very much for
Thanks
allowing
for
me
coming.
the time to present today. My name is Gabriela Kalapush, and I'm from the Clean Air Partnership. We're a charitable environmental organization, and we work with municipalities all across Ontario through the Clean Air Council, as well as the Partners for Climate Protection campaign, to advance their clean air and climate change actions. I just wanted to thank you very much for this opportunity, and to also the Clean Air Partnership would like to provide its full-hearted support for the Toronto's EV strategy. One of the key things that's really, really important about this is not only is this a leadership opportunity for the City of Toronto, but there's a lot of other municipalities all across Ontario who will be following in Toronto's footsteps on their EV strategy. So the direction that Toronto takes will not only influence what happens in Toronto, it will actually influence what happens not only across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, but also across Ontario. So one of the key things, I won't take a lot of time about speaking about the importance of the EV strategy, because that was outlined very, very well in the EV strategy itself. But what I did want to kind of speak to is really the case in the EV market is accelerating within the market on its own. However, it is really important that we don't have since we don't have the time to allow the market to advance on its own pace, the leadership and the policies that government put in place to accelerate the EV readiness and adoption within our communities is really integral to this. When the province of Ontario abdicated on its responsibility to play a leadership role on this file, a good number of municipalities came to us and asked us what options were available to them to ensure that their communities didn't fall too far behind on their EV readiness and uptake. And we know that Ontario is actually falling behind both BC and Quebec on EV readiness and uptake within their communities. So I was so you can understand why I was so pleased to see that Toronto was leading the effort on the development of their EV strategy, and it provided a real boost to and momentum to the other municipalities following in those footsteps. I did want to provide the caveat that the EV transition is in no way a silver bullet that's going to address all our transportation and GHG challenges ahead of us, but it is a big piece of the puzzle. I know that you've already received a deputation from Nancy Smith-Lee, from the Director of CAP's Active Transportation Project, on this file, so I won't raise the importance of active transportation on this, but we do have a really big public health care challenge ahead of us, and the active transportation file plays a big role in helping play a preventative role in getting people more physically active in their day-to-day commuting, and in thereby achieving some public health care benefits that we're all aiming for. So one of the key things that I did want to raise is that there is an element in the EV strategy about the significant role that municipal advocacy can play. And one of the areas that there's a really great opportunity right now for the City of Toronto to play an advocacy role as it comes to the clean fuel standard that's being developed at the federal level. The Clean Fuel Standard is set up to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, and there's two components to it. One is about making reducing the GHG intensity of fossil fuel extraction and use, but the other area is in moving away from fossil fuels in our transportation sector towards electric vehicles and other zero-emission vehicle options. The way the Clean Fuel Standard is being advanced at present, it hasn't been out yet, but one of the key options, we really do need to make sure that that Clean Fuel Standard is set up in a way that not only achieves the efficiencies that can be gained from the fossil fuels, but also drives that market transformation to electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles. So one of the key areas that I think is really important to do is we have a recommendation that the City of Toronto send a council resolution to, or council, advance a council, a resolution that a letter would go to the Environment and Climate Change Minister, speaking to the critical role that the Clean Fuel Standard plays in both reducing the carbon intensity of fossil fuels, as well as ensuring that markets movement towards non-fossil fuel transportation and energy sources. So that's one of the key areas. Just wanted to highlight our strong support for the electric vehicle strategy, the City of Toronto's electric vehicle strategy, and how important it is in driving that leadership that will take place across the regions of Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, as well as across Ontario, and hoping that there is the opportunity to raise the profile of the importance for the Clean Fuel Standard to play a role in efficiency with fossil fuels, as well as driving the market towards electric vehicles. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Questions for the deputant? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I understand that Brian Purcell is here, is that correct? Thank you for coming, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your patience. And thank you, councillors, for taking the time to listen to me today. My name is Brian Purcell. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Programs at the Atmospheric Fund. We are a regional climate agency founded by the City of Toronto to focus on urban climate solutions. And EVs are really critical to our objectives and the city's Transform TO objectives. It's the single most important action outlined in Transform TO, accelerating adoption of EVs. And that's for a simple reason, that transportation accounts for more than a third of our carbon emissions in Toronto. And beyond carbon emissions, it's also a major source of air pollution, which causes an estimated 280 premature deaths every year and 1,100 hospitalizations. So there are multiple benefits to accelerating adoption of EVs, not just for our climate, but also for public health. So I want to commend staff and the consulting team on this project for an inclusive and thorough plan development process. We've been closely involved over the past 18 months on the steering committee and the electric vehicle working group in developing the plan, and it's been a great process which has really been thorough and provided a great opportunity for stakeholders of various types to contribute and voice their views. We've been involved all through, and it's a comprehensive plan that addresses all major barriers to accelerating adoption of electric vehicles. There's some incredibly ambitious and challenging targets in here around vehicle adoption, but these targets are absolutely necessary to achieve our climate objectives and reflective of the scale of the climate emergency. So we support this plan strongly and encourage Council to adopt it and fully resource it. But while we should celebrate the strategy's adoption, we must acknowledge that the hard work begins now after we adopt. Plans and strategies don't reduce emissions, actions do. And the true measure of success will be how quickly and effectively the plan's implemented and the pace at which emissions are reduced. We urge the city to begin implementation immediately and with a sense of urgency that befits the climate emergency that was declared last year. We believe the most important role for the city is accelerating deployment of charging infrastructure. That's because range anxiety and access to charging infrastructure are two of the key barriers to electric vehicle adoptions and are the barriers that the city is best placed to help address. Cities have several key roles to play, including deployment of charging infrastructure and including leveraging our assets by deploying it on street. While the strategy is comprehensive, there is a major gap in here. There are no targets or timelines for deploying on-street charging infrastructure in the city. Really, and that's because staff and the consulting team couldn't drive and create targets and timelines because we haven't yet piloted installing such infrastructure, and we don't yet have the knowledge of what it takes and how quickly and what scale we can deploy it as a city. That's unfortunate because installing on-street charging infrastructure should be the single most important element of the strategy, in my view. We've known that for a decade, which is why Council approved the first on-street charging pilot in 2012. And while there's been some great progress that's been made on the pilot, there are still no chargers installed under that pilot, and no timeline yet for installation or operation of those chargers. Similarly, residential on-street charging is critical as it addresses the problem of so-called garage orphans, the many Torontonians who lack access to appropriate spaces at home to install charging infrastructure. And the city rightly approved a pilot for that in 2017 to address that issue. However, we haven't yet installed any of those chargers, and there's, again, no construction schedule for getting that in the ground. So just as a contrast, the City of Montreal began piloting charging on street 5 years ago and has recently celebrated completing 750 on-street charging installations with their partners in a comprehensive network that includes both residential and commercial on-street charging infrastructure. So that's a picture of what leadership can look like in deploying this type of infrastructure to get the city ready for electric vehicles. We'd really like to see the city's deployment of on-street charging accelerated, beginning by completing the pilots this year. There's no reason that can't be done. And in the report back in 2021 on the plan, we'd like to see building out a strategy and timelines for how we can accelerate that at a larger scale beyond the very small pilots that we've approved already. TAP is committed to supporting the plan's implementation over the coming years. We'll continue to lend our expertise and support through the EV Working Group and otherwise. We also can support the plan financially through our grants program and would be happy to support the city in that way. And in closing, I'd just like to urge the Council to adopt the strategy and implement it with the urgency and commitment that befits the climate emergency. And that includes accelerating progress on some of the previously approved initiatives as well as the new initiatives in the strategy. Accelerating adoption of EVs is imperative not only for preventing catastrophic climate change, but will also help us build a healthier, more prosperous, and more resilient city. Thanks for your time and attention. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the Deputy? Councillor Cole?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I just noted Montreal has 750 on-street charging stations?
Yes.
And how many do we have?
0.
Were they able to access, was this done with just City of Montreal money?
No, the provincial money as well, yeah.
So there was provincial money. Was there any federal money towards that?
I can't answer that specifically. There may well have been, yeah.
So it might be hard for us to do without provincial, and there is no provincial money now for...
Not currently. There is federal money in the offing. They have an ongoing funding program with rounds being released regularly for deploying charging infrastructure which the city qualifies for.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Any other questions for the Deputant? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hamish Wilson?
Greetings. Thank you. I'm a little less optimistic or supportive of all of this. Absolutely, we are in a climate emergency. There's no doubt about that. It's gotten incredibly serious. However, the challenge is, are we being responsive enough? And I honestly think that this is kind of tending to tinker around the edges versus the radical changes that we actually need. We're not doing that well on some of the basics from, let's see, there was the Toronto target from the Changing Atmosphere Conference The study that came out of that from the former City of Toronto suggested a Bloor Danforth bike lane. Oh, by 1995, we've still got a keystone gap to fill on Bloor Street East. I know I keep coming back to this, but gosh dang, it's also subway relief, which is really important. The transport does lead our greenhouse gas emissions. There's no doubt about that. Here's something new from 2007. It's time to start counting emissions like calories. Oh, I'm sorry, that's really focused in on it, or extra focus. But basically, there's a lot of other things in the whole equation that we should be looking at. The concrete, the air conditioner, the lighting, the oils, the lithium in the batteries, the transport energy for all these vehicles, if we go to heavy vehicles or trying to replace current levels of automobility with electric automobility. I sent in something, I'm pretty sure I sent it in, that copied a tweet from the European Cycling Federation that did a life cycle analysis on a kilogram per passenger basis. A bike was at 21 grams, an e-bike was at 22 grams, a bus was at 101 grams, and a car was at 271. So that's what we should be doing, is supporting our biking and our transit far, far, far more than private mobility. And another aspect of all this greenhouse gas stuff is that aluminum is very prized in both bikes and buses and cars. However, there are some smelting gases that are basically permanent greenhouse gases that have been associated with it, some PFCs, and it's really bad news. The space demands of just replicating automobility as we have had it, are also not really conducive to functional mobility. This is from the NACTO guideline. That's what the capacity of a private lane or a lane with cars, mixed transit, two-way protected bike lane, far more better at moving people, dedicated transit lane, and then a real heavy-duty bus rail up to 25,000 people an hour. That's the sort of thing that we need, because the space demands of automobility are really extreme, and that's part of our congestion problem. Here's another little blast from the past. Lastman predicts automobile-free downtown by 2011. That's the sort of direction that we need to be going in. Because, yeah, we need to have actually, if we're going to go to EVs, we need to actually do as many other European cities are doing and constrain the access of vehicles, especially the polluting ones, into our core, because this isn't necessarily showing so well. If we did a car-free or a car-reduced, a clean car-only zone from High Park, the rail line through Rosedale Valley Road and the Don River on the east. That's the sort of thing that we should be doing concurrently with this sort of, we're going to go to EVs. Let's actually squeeze the cars to make sure that we have a better downtown, because they are still going to be dangerous. There are some stats that indicate that the electric vehicles actually are a bit more dangerous because they don't have they're quieter. They don't have the auditory cues that a pedestrian or a cyclist might have. So we still may be having a lot of damage to people from the electric cars, which may have really quick uptake as well, acceleration. So I'm not a fan of ever more automobility. If we're going to actually put more money into things, I would suggest that we need a vehicle registration tax of what, maybe $600 a vehicle or something. This is another old stat that I keep sharing out. $2,700 per vehicle worth of avoided cost from Vancouver how many decades ago now. If we're going to go ahead with this stuff, let's have subsidies or more user pay, because heck, there's a mountain of transit expenditure.
You're a little over 5 minutes, if you could wrap up.
It's something, but we're so behind.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for the deputant? No, thank you very much. Alexandra Machacek? How close was I? Great, thank you for coming. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I agree with Hamish in that this is a very complex issue and there are other factors that we should be addressing. However, I also have experience as someone who's lived in a more distant aspect of the city and what commuting far distances is like, and recognize that there will always want to be drivers, especially those who are commuting far from the GTA. We have Markham, we have people coming from Oakville. I know someone coming, they take a 2.5-hour route via transit to my workplace, actually. We do have people coming from really wide and far for our workplaces downtown. And that being said, I myself am an EV driver. I adopted my first vehicle a couple of years ago, and it was fabulous, actually. It's, as Hamish said, they are quite quiet. You can quite nicely sneak up on pedestrians and cyclists, but it's very fuel efficient. It's one that also operates on gasoline. I think we should venture away from those. However, it was a fantastic experience in the beginning. I had the luxury, however, of living at home with my family in a residential home. So access to charging facilities was very easy. I could just hook it up into my garage, and there weren't very many questions asked. I paid $40 for my charging per month, and that was about it. I rarely had to refuel. When I started to venture off on my own, however, as a renter in the city, I began to realize how prohibitive driving an EV feels in the city, especially when you're considering costs for the majority. I have a reasonable salary. I am fortunate in that. And as a single person without a family, I still feel the restrictions driving an EV. And if we are going in this direction, which we should, I think, imminently convert more into electrical vehicles for those of us who are driving, having more access to charging facilities, I think, is an urgent matter. And so I think the majority of us who don't have access to homes, which can be more expensive unless you're doing rooming type of projects, so having access to charging in condos, in apartments, in long-term parking lots, I think would be really wonderful and important. There are a lot of barriers that include legal assistance. There's a lot of fees involved. It's complicated to have charging facilities available in these buildings. I think if we are going to increase access to charging, maybe perhaps in the transform TO process, while we're rebuilding or are transforming our buildings from the inside towards more sustainable infrastructure, we perhaps also address EV charging at the same time, because as other debutantes have mentioned, construction around condos can be quite disruptive for all those involved. And lastly, I would like to say that I am really grateful and enthusiastic that Toronto is entertaining or intends to expand our EV infrastructure. It's wonderful. I do want to inquire whether we have a lofty enough goal of, I saw 220,000 EVs, or hopeful for EVs in 2030, approximating about 20% of our personal drivers in the city. And that would be about 22,000 drivers per year, increasing their vehicles to be more sustainably fueled. And I wonder if that is fast enough. When we're talking about a client emergency, I work in healthcare myself. It's the city that's declared a climate emergency. And there's emergency when you go to the hospital on the weekend because the clinic is closed and you have a cough. And then there's an emergency when something is urgent and imminent, and if you don't address it, you're in big doo-doo. So I wanted to ask if we are being aggressive enough, and I do agree with Hamish that we have a lot of other factors to address, and that accessibility in the city in terms of transit, that's also why I myself became a driver, is just taking the bus to subway bus home after a night shift when subway is only available at 9 a.m. on a Sunday is a bit taxing on the body when you have to go back in the same night to take care of people. And then also as a cyclist, I have wiped out myself. It can be quite daunting driving on Queen Street. So there are limitations in our public transportation and cycling availability that I think would be lovely if they were addressed soon as well. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions for the deputant?
Yes, I have.
Sure. Councillor Cole?
Thank you. Just thought-provoking. So perhaps we should look at policies when we approve new developments, that any new development like rental developments or condos, which are going up everywhere, that prior to approval, they have to include EV charging in that building.
I agree. I think that I noticed that the item or the documents included in this item they have education as part of our process, and I think education is always important. I do think that when people are shopping for vehicles, they look for accessibility first. And I know those who are more prudent, I was more romanticizing the idea before I purchased mine. I didn't realize how difficult. But yes, if it was automatically available, I think that creates a green light for people to approach EVs.
May I ask what kind of vehicle did you purchase?
It's a Chevrolet Volt with a V, like Victor.
Which is no longer in production.
I thought I saw a 2020, but I'm not sure.
No,
or 2019, rather. It's a 2018 that I leased.
I guess all that's left from them is the Spark.
A Spark. They do have a new Toyota Prius that's
oh, yes.
a plug-in hybrid now.
There's all over the map, but Chevy.
Okay, sounds like a wonderful chit chat, but it's late in the day.
Sorry.
Any other genuine questions for the?
Genuine. Wait a minute now.
Okay.
You're insulting the deputant.
No, I was insulting a counselor. Counselor Perusa.
How long does it take to charge one of these cars?
Oh, thank you for asking. I forgot to mention that. So with the way the technology is for my vehicle right now, if you have a supercharger, it's between 4 and 5 hours. Or if you plug it into a standard outlet, you can either charge at 8 amperes or 12 amperes, and that takes up to 13 hours. So it can be very limiting. There are places with temporary charging, like if you go to IKEA or to different dealerships. I don't want to discourage or dissuade the implementation of charging stations in these areas. However, it's not the most practical because we're not spending a lot of time in grocery stores unless you want to park overnight without their permission. I don't think a lot of business owners would appreciate that. So having more, I think, long-term charging availability is the most practical for EV drivers. And though I think the technology is getting better. I think I really am ignorant, but I think Tesla, for example, they have superchargers where you can charge a significant portion of your vehicle in 1 hour or 2 hours, something like that. And I think it will get better with battery technology, but right now, standard outlet, it can take 12 hours. So at home, I think is best. I don't know if that was too long of an answer.
No. You know what? I just hadn't thought about that. So we're like creating all these parking spots for like 12 hours, right, all over.
Well, it would be, I'm thinking if somebody, so with guest parking and it would have to be parking where that's already taking place. So I think with Green P parking, for example, you would pay overnight rates. It wouldn't be parking that's already temporary, so taking advantage of spaces or parking inappropriately in areas where visitors aren't welcome. I think it would have to be designated areas where people either they're commonly there or people can expect to go where charging stations are offered.
And how much is a 12-hour charge typically charged at? Like, what does it cost?
So
just for the charge.
I think it can be about 10 cents to 35 cents an hour. I think we'll say, I haven't checked in a little while. I've been paying a kind of a basic rate every month just to approximate my electricity bill, but I think overall I pay about $40 approximately per month in electricity. If I don't have to gas up, then it's great, but I think between 30 and 40 cents per hour. So about $3 to $4 a charge. Mm-hmm. I charge at my rental home right now. I had my landlord install an outlet. He was very gracious about that. There are people who are more willing these days, but the stress of being a rental, somebody who is renting and trying to find a location in the city was immense in my price range. Still being able to save and go to work and have my vehicle. So I realized after, I thought it might be time to break up with, I call my car Misty, but I've been trying to be persistent. Yeah.
And excuse my ignorance, but
no, it's okay.
Unlike pocket chargers, there's no like portable charger for these cars, right? No. Yeah, there's no like portable battery that you can charge and then use that to charge. No, okay.
You don't mean the actual equipment to hook up to the car, do you? You mean a separate battery?
No, I meant like, pocket juice, like for your cell phone, you.
Oh, no, that would be cool. That would be great. Not yet. I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Perusa. Any other questions for the deputant? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you kindly for your time.
Darnell Harris? Well, thank you very much for your patience.
Good afternoon, all. So very briefly, we noticed that this report defined electric mobility, but within that, there is no mention of e-assist cycles for businesses, and the only reference to adding e-bikes is adding it to the Toronto bike share. As far as I can tell, that's all that we can see within there. Deloitte expects the number of e-bikes will outpace all other e-vehicle sales in the next couple of years. They're expecting about 130 million of these to be sold worldwide. New York has just launched a cargo bike pilot specifically with the two devices you've seen here. In fact, I think that UPS one, there's a picture with John Tory in it from last year. Suffice to say, it's a concern because although psychologistics does not appear anywhere in this document, there are certainly a number of things within it that would benefit from that. For example, they speak of major economic opportunities, so research in schools, waste and end-of-life reuse, support efforts to grow economic opportunities, as well as to help attract businesses. Well, all of that certainly, there's an opportunity to do so through micromobility because the costs of having these devices that can hold several hundred pounds, as I've already spoken to this committee about, are much lower than an electric vehicle, which is tens of thousands of dollars at best. So certainly, in terms of the opportunities here, this is something that businesses want to see. They're investing tens of millions and more in fleets of this size for e-commerce. The federal government is interested, the provincial government is interested. And certainly when it comes to things like, what does the city need to ask the province to do? Well, part of that is regulation around these. So certainly there needs to be some sort of amendment to this plan to ensure that psychologistics and practical micromobility devices that are used for business are not left out of this, because that's simply going to shortcut opportunities for businesses and people all across the city of Toronto. And I yield my time to the chair.
All right, thank you very much. Questions for the deputant? No? Okay. All right, thank you very much. Questions for staff? Councillor Layton?
Thank you. And just a couple here. I know it's quite late in the day, and we've been at this for some time. But I shared some of Darnell's concerns that he just voiced, and so did a couple other speakers. Why were e-bikes and e-scooters, why weren't they included in the EV strategy?
Through the chair, the focus of the strategy was on the electrification of personal vehicles because they currently account for 80% of 38% of the greenhouse gas emissions. There is an activity focused on micromobility in which we reference, as the deputant stated, the opportunity to look at e-bikes first through the bike share fleet, but also potentially in additional ways. So we're reporting back on that separately, but we do acknowledge micromobility and electric micromobility having a role.
Because I would argue that electrification of my cargo bike would be electrifying my personal vehicle as well, just in kind of the opposite direction. So the strategy is more about the transition from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric-powered cars, gasoline-powered cars to electric-powered cars.
This strategy seeks recognizing that some trips are likely to remain car-based. This strategy seeks to electrify those trips while recognizing that that is one part of an overall sustainable transportation system.
On the on-street charging pilots, is anyone here that's able to tell me how far, or at least what the expected date of the installation is?
Through the chair, my name is Joe Bealey from Toronto Hydro, and the plan is to get them in this spring.
Great. Then my motion isn't going to cause you too much grief.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor McKelvey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't plan to speak later, so I will start by thanking everybody that was involved in preparing this great study. I have 4 questions, so I'll try and be fast. How does this interface with Better Homes TO and that initiative?
Through the chair, we recently amended the Home Energy Loan Program, which is one component of Better Homes TO, which is a low-interest financing mechanism, to now include loans for level 2 electric vehicle chargers. So that's a concrete example of the ways in which we're looking to integrate electric readiness into our retrofitting programs. And certainly supporting electric mobility through our buildings programs is something that we're focused on.
Okay, great. And I have 17,000 single-family homes in my community, so I think there's a huge potential for, because many of them will drive to a transit node. 5%, though, some will say it's ambitious. I think it sounds great, and it's a great goal. 5% by 2025. What is the typical fleet turnover that's happening annually, anyway? Like, what percentage of new cars every year need to be electric to hit that?
I'll let you pull that. In the study, we've assumed 11-year vehicle turnover. And so the percentage of new car sales, I'm going to need to get back to you to hit those overall targets, but we do have it calculated.
And what is in this year's budget ask for this program versus next year? Because I see a lot of speak about next year and 2021, but what is being done in 2020 to work towards this?
In the 2020 budget, in support of this electric vehicle strategy, there's a $150,000 ask, which focuses on the critical next step, in our opinion, which is a public charging location study. So identifying where across the city it would be most valuable and important to install public charging, and also some education and outreach components. Separate to this particular strategy, there's also a budget ask for greening the city's own fleet, so making sure that our own vehicles are electrified or green. And that's what we're looking at in 2020. The rest of the actions we're reporting back through the 2021 budget cycle.
Okay, question 4, last one. What is the status of the federal incentives program? Is that still ongoing, continuing? And what sorts of things need to happen with the federal or provincial governments to kind of incentivize this sort of turnover? How are you incorporating that into the strategy?
So certainly the removal of the provincial purchase incentive for EVs had an impact on uptake of electric vehicles. The federal incentive is still ongoing. So as an individual to purchase an electric vehicle, you do receive a $5,000 purchase rebate. It's important. We're very supportive of it. We've identified advocacy to other orders of government as an important part of this process. So when you look at jurisdictions, municipalities that have been really successful in installing charging infrastructure, which is the second part beyond the purchase rebate, much of that charging infrastructure has not been paid for by the municipality. It's been paid for by other orders of government.
Thank you, and thank you for this great report.
Thank you, Councillor McKelvey. Any other questions for staff?
Just a quick question. The TTC, is it in any way contemplating getting rid of the dirty diesel buses on our streets and replacing them with electric buses? We used to have the trolleys, I remember. remember them telling me that Howard Moscow and I were crazy for trying to keep the trolleys and replace them with diesels. But anyways, what about the TTC?
Through the chair, our TTC colleagues would be best positioned to answer this, but we do currently have 14 electric buses on the road. We'll have 60 on the road by the end of 2020, and there are plans in place to further electrify the bus fleet.
So that they are planning to eventually convert the diesel to battery-operated vehicles.
I can't speak, through the chair, I can't speak to the nature of their electrification plans, but they have articulated in the TTC Sustainable Fleet Plan their approach to reaching the overall net zero emissions from transportation.
Well, any plans to bring back the trolley on Weston Road and Mount Pleasant and those places? No,
Through the
just
chair,
facetious question. Okay.
No, thank you, Councillor Cole, for that suggestion. Any other questions for staff? No, we can go to speakers. I do have a motion here from Councillor Layton. So if you want to put that on the floor, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you very much. The City Council direct the General Manager, Transportation Services, in consultation with Director, Environment and Energy, and all other relevant city divisions to complete the downtown on-street charging pilot and residential on-street charging pilots in 2020. And two, that City Council direct the Director of Energy and Environment in consultation with the Electric Vehicle Working Group to report back as part of the 2021 status update on targets and timelines for expanding deployment of on-street electric charging infrastructure. First of all, just thank you for staff for putting this together. When you talk about going from less than 1% to 5% as being a lofty goal, it kind of sounds a little comical. But given our starting point as a society in general, but as a city, we got a lot of moving to do, and moving that first 5% is probably going to be the hardest 5% or the hardest shift that we'll make in this. I'm a cyclist. I don't own a car. We rent a car on the rare occasion that we need one. But there are many people in our city, businesses and individuals that require personal vehicles on occasion. We have not done well to give people other options to move around the city in effectively a carbon-free way. That unfortunately, we will probably need to have single occupancy vehicles on our roads for at least the foreseeable future. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't shift away from that and should be doing everything we can to encourage walking, riding bicycles, taking public transit, and all of those things first. But like the 3 R's of recycling, there are the same rules apply here, that we need to do what we can to get people out of their cars and onto public transit and riding bikes and doing all those things. But where we can't, we need to look at fuel shifting. That is well recognized as a logical course of action in us to achieving our zero emissions. We started doing this many years ago when this discussion was first brought about. I was on the committee that first approved the pilot, and since then, there has been very little action. It has not been the City of Toronto's fault. It has not largely not been Toronto Hydro's fault. There was provincial regulations that prohibited the moving forward of a file like this, or of this pilot project. Fortunately, that has changed, and we are able now to move forward with this pilot project, which like it's clear that not every individual is going to be able to install one of these at their home. They might not have the luxury of either A, owning the property, B, having a landlord that's reasonable enough to install it for them, or C, having the facilities at where they live to accommodate that. whether or not it's a tall building or not. It just may not be in the configuration of that living, of that home that allows for that. So it's not necessarily that that's going to drive EVs into the future. So this is going to be an enormously important pilot project, and I'm glad to hear that it's moving forward this year. So I don't mind putting this forward on the advice of the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, is saying, make sure it's done this year, and then look to how you can improve it once you get some of that early data in place. I will say, though, that I think it would have been useful to expand the overall focus of the electric vehicle strategy to be beyond single occupancy vehicles and go beyond the maybe buses and TTC.
You ran out of time.
It wasn't that much time. I haven't been speaking that long.
You don't think so?
No. Well, I'll just quickly say that.
Just wrap up.
There are other forms of electrification of moving people around that I think are equally important, and we could be making those investments in. Because getting people out of their cars may be easier if they were moving into a lighter electric vehicle rather than straight onto the bicycle, which isn't for everyone.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Councillor Layton. Any other speakers on the item? Yes, Councillor Cole.
Yeah, again, I want to thank staff for a very detailed and very, very comprehensive report covering so many areas. It's not an easy thing to do, so all your work is really appreciated, considering what you're tasked with. I just think in many ways we are behind the curve big time. I mean, if you look at the demand there is for electric vehicles, I mean, when you see Mustang coming out with an electric vehicle that's already sold out, even before one has been put on the road, when you see you cannot buy an electric vehicle in Toronto right now. There's a waiting list for up to a year, 2 years to get an electric vehicle. The public has finally turned the corner, and I guess it's because of the breakthrough work of Tesla, and they have now have a massive plant in Shanghai. And they're able to get, electric vehicles that have a lot of horsepower. I mean, so as much as we worry about speed, the fact is the electric vehicles are becoming very attractive. So there's going to be a huge demand for charging stations, and there isn't any infrastructure here. So I don't think where we're at right now in the city, and it's not the city's fault given that we don't have any provincial support in this initiative like they do in Quebec, we are going to have to, I could see us back here in a year when people are able to buy electric vehicles. They're going to say, where do we charge? We can't charge at home. We're renters. We can't charge at work. So there's going to be huge pent-up demand for us to build charging infrastructure, which is basically non-existent. It is really marginal at best. And in the second part of it, I do think that we're going to have to get our public transit infrastructure electrified. I mean, luckily we have the streetcars are electrified, our subways are electrified, but I think the big gap here is one of the real problems with our downtown core and our congested core main streets is that we have dirty diesel buses, which is 18th century technology running in the streets of Toronto. So we're pretending to be a modern, clean city, yet we've got diesel carbon being spewed out of these buses 24 hours a day. What's that?
Who's responsible for that?
We are all are. Joint responsibility. Certainly I wasn't, because I was a big supporter of the trolley buses, and I tried to keep the trolley buses in as part of our fleet. But we were overruled and told we were old-fashioned, that trolley buses were not the thing to do. But anyways, the main thing is that there's going to be a huge demand, and I think that we're going to have to really somehow find a ways and means to step up our investment in all forms of electric mobility. And I think bring it all on, scooters, bicycles, drones, whatever we need, I would say go for it. Because we cannot, if there is a climate emergency that we've declared, you voted for a climate emergency declaration, what are you doing about it? So I'm saying let's do something and let's really step up our game and electrify everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cole. Any other speakers on the item? No? Okay, we have Councillor Layton's motion. We'll put it on the screen, please. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And the item is amended. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried.
Install a charging station at the end of my driveway.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just.
That concludes our business for today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Jar next to it and say, just leave a few.
Councillors, thank you very much. Clerk staff, city staff,
Exactly.
and once again, a happy new year, successful new year. And we'll see you soon.
Say hi in person, yeah.